Chapter 20 of Mystery of a Hansom Cab by Fergus Hume. Read for LibriVox.org into the public domain. The Argus gives its opinion. The morning after the trial was concluded, the following article in reference to the matter appeared in the Argus. During the past 3 months we have frequently in our columns commented on the extraordinary case which is now so widely known as the Hansom Cab tragedy. We can safely say that it is the most remarkable case which has ever come under the notice of our criminal court, and the verdict given by the jury yesterday has enveloped the matter in a still deeper mystery. By a train of strange coincidences, Mr. Brian Fitzgerald, a young squatter, was suspected of having murdered White, and had it not been for the timely appearance of the woman Rawlins, who turned up at the 11th hour, we feel sure that a verdict of guilty would have been given, and an innocent man would have suffered punishment for the crime of another. Fortunately for the prisoner, and for the interests of justice, his counsel, Mr. Calton, by unwearied diligence, was able to discover the last witness, and prove an alibi. Had it not been for this, in spite of the remarks made by the learned counsel in his brilliant speech yesterday, which resulted in the acquittal of the prisoner, we question very much if the rest of the evidence in favour of the accused would have been sufficient to persuade the jury that he was an innocent man. The only points in favour of Mr. Fitzgerald were the inability of the cabman Royston to swear to him as the man who got into the cab with White, the wearing of a diamond ring on the forefinger of the right hand, whereas Mr. Fitzgerald wears no rings, and the difference in time sworn to by the cabman Rankin and the landlady. Against these points, however, the prosecution placed a mass of evidence, which seemed conclusively to prove the guilt of the prisoner, but the appearance of Sal Rawlins in the witness-box put an end to all doubt. In language which could not be mistaken for anything else than the truth, she positively swore that Mr. Fitzgerald was in one of the slums off Bourke Street, between the hours of 1 and 2 on Friday morning, at which time the murder was committed. Under these circumstances the jury unanimously agreed, and returned a verdict of not guilty, and the prisoner was forthwith acquitted. We have to congratulate his counsel, Mr. Calton, for the able speech he made for the defence, and also Mr. Fitzgerald for his providential escape from a dishonourable and undeserved punishment. He leaves the court without a stain on his character, and with the respect and sympathy of all Australians, for the courage and dignity with which he comported himself throughout, while resting under the shadow of such a serious charge. But now that it has been conclusively proved that he is innocent, the question arises in everyone's mind: who is the murderer of Oliver White? The man who committed this dastardly crime is still at large, and for all we know may be in our midst. Emboldened by the impunity with which he has escaped the hands of justice, he may be walking securely down our streets, and talking of the very crime of which he is the perpetrator. Secure in the thought that all traces of him have been lost for ever, from the time he alighted from Rankin's cab at Powlett Street, he has ventured probably to remain in Melbourne, and for all that anyone knows, he may have been in the court during the late trial. Nay, this very article may meet his eye, and he may rejoice at the futile efforts which have been made to find him. But let him beware. Justice is not blind, but blindfolded, and when he least expects it, she will tear the bandage from her keen eyes, and drag him forth to the light of day to receive the reward of his deed. Owing to the strong evidence against Fitzgerald, that is the only direction in which the detectives have hitherto looked, but baffled on one side, they will look on the other, and this time may be successful. That such a man as the murderer of Oliver White should be at large is a matter of danger, not only to individual citizens but to the community at large, for it is a well-known fact that a tiger who once tastes human blood never overcomes his craving for it, and without doubt the man who so daringly and coolly murdered a drunken and therefore defenceless man will not hesitate to commit a second crime. The present feeling of all classes in Melbourne must be one of terror, that such a man should be at large, and must, in great measure, resemble the fear which filled everyone's heart in London when the Marr murders were committed, and it was known that the murderer had escaped. Any one who has read De Quincey's graphic description of the crime perpetrated by Williams must tremble to think that such another devil incarnate is in our midst. It is an imperative necessity that such a feeling should be done away with. But how is this to be managed? It is one thing to speak and another to act. There seems to be no possible clue discoverable at present which can lead to the discovery of the real murderer. The man in the light coat who got out of Rankin's cab at Powlett Street, East Melbourne, designedly, as it now appears, in order to throw suspicion on Fitzgerald, has vanished completely as the witches in Macbeth, and left no trace behind. It was 2 o'clock in the morning when he left the cab, and in a quiet suburb like East Melbourne no one would be about, so that he could easily escape unseen. There seems to be but one chance of ever tracing him, and that is to be found in the papers which were stolen from the pocket of the dead man. What they were, only 2 persons knew, and one knows now. The first 2 were White and the woman who was called the Queen, and both of them are now dead. The other who knows now is the man who committed the crime. There can be no doubt that these papers were the motive for the crime, as no money was taken from the pockets of the deceased. The fact also that the papers were carried in a pocket made inside the waistcoat of the deceased shows that they were of value. Now the reason we think that the dead woman knew of the existence of these papers is simply this. It appears that she came out from England with White as his mistress, and after staying some time in Sydney came on to Melbourne. How she came into such a foul and squalid den as that she died in, we are unable to say, unless, seeing that she was given to drink, she was picked up drunk by some Samaritan of the slums, and carried to Mrs. Rawlins's humble abode. White visited her there frequently, but appears to have made no attempt to remove her to a better place, alleging as his reason that the doctor said she would die if taken into the air. Our reporter learned from one of the detectives that the dead woman was in the habit of talking to White about certain papers, and on one occasion was overheard to say to him, "They'll make your fortune if you play your cards well." This was told to the detective by the woman Rawlins, to whose providential appearance Mr. Fitzgerald owes his escape. From this it can be gathered that the papers, whatever they might be, were of value, and sufficient to tempt another to commit a murder in order to obtain them. White, therefore, being dead, and his murderer having escaped, the only way of discovering the secret which lies at the root of this tree of crime is to find out the history of the woman who died in the slum. Traced back for some years, circumstances may be discovered which will reveal what these papers contained, and once that is found, we can confidently say that the murderer will be soon discovered. This is the only chance of finding out the cause, and the author of this mysterious murder, and if it fails, we fear the Hansom Cab tragedy will have to be relegated to the list of undiscovered crimes, and the assassin of White will have no other punishment than that of the remorse of his own conscience. End of Chapter 20. Read by Sabella Denton. For more free audiobooks or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 21 of Mystery of a Hansom Cab by Fergus Hume. Read for LibriVox.org into the public domain. 3 months afterwards. A hot December day, with a cloudless blue sky, and a sun blazing down on the earth, clothed in all the beauty of summer garments. Such a description of snowy December sounds perchance a trifle strange to English ears. It may strike them as being somewhat fantastic, as was the play in A Midsummer Night's Dream to Demetrius when he remarked, "This is hot ice and wondrous cold fire." But here in Australia we are in the realm of contrariety, and many things other than dreams go by contrary. Here black swans are an established fact, and the proverb concerning them, made when they were considered as mythical a bird as the phoenix, has been rendered null and void by the discoveries of Captain Cook. Here ironwood sinks and pumice stone floats, which must strike the curious spectator as a queer freak on the part of Dame Nature. At home the Edinburgh mail bears the hardy traveller to a cold climate, with snowy mountains and a wintry blast, but here the further north one goes the hotter it gets, till one arrives in Queensland, where the heat is so great that a profane traveller of an epigrammatic turn of mind once fittingly called it an amateur hell. But however contrary, as Mrs. Gamp would say, nature be in her dwellings, the English race out in this great continent are much the same as in the old country, John Bull, Paddy, and Sandy all being of a conservative turn of mind, and with strong opinions as to the keeping up of old customs. Therefore, on a hot Christmas day, with the sun 100 odd in the shade, Australian revellers sit down to the roast beef and plum pudding of old England, which they eat contentedly as the orthodox thing, and on New Year's Eve the festive Celt repairs to the doors of his friends with a bottle of whisky and a cheering verse of Old Lang Syne. Still, it is these peculiar customs that give an individuality to a nation, and John Bull abroad loses none of his insular obstinacy, but keeps his Christmas in the old fashion, and wears his clothes in the new fashion, without regard to heat or cold. A nation that never surrenders to the fire of an enemy cannot be expected to give in to the fire of the sun, but if some ingenious mortal would only invent some light and airy costume, after the fashion of the Greek dress, and Australians would consent to adopt the same, Life in Melbourne and her sister cities would be much cooler than it is at present. Madge was thinking somewhat after this fashion as she sat on the wide verandah, in a state of exhaustion from the heat, and stared out at the wide plains lying parched and arid under the blazing sun. There was a dim kind of haze rising from the excessive heat, ranging midway between heaven and earth, and through its tremulous veil the distant hills looked aerial and unreal. Stretched out before her was the garden with its intensely vivid flowers. To look at them merely was to increase one's caloric condition. Great bushes of oleanders, with their bright pink blossoms, luxurious rose trees, with their yellow, red, and white blooms, and all along the border a rainbow of many-coloured flowers, with such brilliant tints that the eye ached to see them in the hot sunshine, and turned restfully to the cool green of the trees which encircled the lawn. In the centre was a round pool, surrounded by a ring of white marble, and containing a still sheet of water, which flashed like a mirror in the blinding light. The homestead of Yabba Yallook's station was a long low house, with no upper story, and with a wide verandah running nearly round it. Cool green blinds were hung between the pillars to keep out the sun, and all along were scattered lounging chairs of basket-work, with rugs, novels, empty soda-water bottles, and all the other evidences that Mr. Frettlby's guests had been wise, and stayed inside during the noonday heat. Madge was seated in one of these comfortable chairs, and she divided her attention between the glowing beauty of the world outside, which she could see through a narrow slit in the blinds. But she did not seem greatly interested in her book, and it was not long before she let it fall unheeded to the ground and took refuge in her own thoughts. The trial through which she had so recently passed had been a great one, and it had not been without its outward result. It had left its impress on her beautiful face, and there was a troubled look in her eyes. After Brian's acquittal of the murder of Oliver White, she had been taken by her father up to the station, in the hope it would restore her to health. The mental strain which had been on her during the trial had nearly brought on an attack of brain fever, but here, far from the excitement of town life, in the quiet seclusion of the country, she had recovered her health, but not her spirits. Women are more impressionable than men, and it is perhaps for this reason that they age quicker. A trouble which would pass lightly over a man leaves an indelible mark on a woman, both physically and mentally, and the terrible episode of White's murder had changed Madge from a bright and merry girl into a grave and beautiful woman. Sorrow is a potent enchantress. Once she touches the heart, life can never be quite the same again. We never more surrender ourselves entirely to pleasure, and often we find so many of the things we have longed for are, after all, but dead sea-fruit. Sorrow is the veiled Isis of the world, and once we penetrate her mystery and see her deeply furrowed face and mournful eyes, the magic light of romance dies all away, and we realize the hard, bitter fact of life in all its nakedness. Madge felt something of this. She saw the world now, not as the fantastic fairyland of her girlish dreams, but as the sorrowful vale of tears through which we all must walk till we reach the promised land. And Brian, he also had undergone a change, for there were a few white hairs now amid his curly chestnut locks, and his character, from being gay and bright, had become moody and irritable. After the trial he had left town immediately, in order to avoid meeting with his friends, and had gone up to his station, which was next to that of the Frettlbys. There he worked hard all day, and smoked hard all night, thinking over the secret which the dead woman had told him, and which threatened to overshadow his life. Every now and then he rode over and saw Madge, but this was generally when he knew her father to be away from Melbourne, for of late he had disliked the millionaire. Madge could not but condemn his attitude, remembering how her father had stood beside him in his recent trouble. Yet there was another reason why Brian kept aloof from Yabba Yallook station. He did not wish to meet any of the gay society which was there, knowing that since his trial he was an object of curiosity and sympathy to every one, a position galling enough to his proud nature. At Christmas time Frettlby had asked several people up from Melbourne, and though Madge would rather have been left alone, yet she could not refuse her father, and had to play hostess with a smiling brow and aching heart. Who a month since had joined the noble army of Benedicts, was there with Mrs. Rolleston, née Miss Featherweight, who ruled him with a rod of iron. Having bought Felix with her money, she had determined to make good use of him, and being ambitious to shine in Melbourne society, had insisted upon Felix studying politics, so that when the next general election came round he could enter Parliament. Felix had rebelled at first, but ultimately gave way, as he found that when he had a good novel concealed among his parliamentary papers, time passed quite pleasantly, and he got the reputation of a hard worker at little cost. They had brought up Julia with them, and this young person had made up her mind to become the second Mrs. Frettlby. She had not received much encouragement, but, like the English at Waterloo, did not know when she was beaten, and carried on the siege of Mr. Frettlby's heart in an undaunted manner. Dr. Chinston had come up for a little relaxation, and gave never a thought to his anxious patients, or the many sick rooms he was in the habit of visiting. A young English fellow, called Peterson, who amused himself by travelling, an old colonist, full of reminiscences of the old days, when, by God, sir, we hadn't a gas lamp in the whole of Melbourne, and several other people completed the party. They had all gone off to the billiard-room, and left Madge in her comfortable chair, half asleep. Suddenly she started, as she heard a step behind her, and turning saw Sal Rawlins, in the neatest of black gowns, with a coquettish white cap and apron, and an open book. Madge had been so delighted with Sal for saving Brian's life that she had taken her into her service as maid. Mr. Frettlby had offered strong opposition at first that a fallen woman like Sal should be near his daughter, but Madge was determined to rescue the unhappy girl from the life of sin she was leading, and so at last he reluctantly consented. Brian too had objected, but ultimately yielded, as he saw that Madge had set her heart on it. Mother Guttersnipe objected at first, characterizing the whole affair as cussed humbug, but she likewise gave in, and Sal became maid to Miss Frettlby, who immediately set to work to remedy Sal's defective education by teaching her to read. The book she held in her hand was a spelling-book, and this she handed to Madge. "I think I knows it now, miss," she said respectfully, as Madge looked up with a smile. "Do you indeed?" said Madge gaily. "You will be able to read in no time, Sal." "Read this," said Sal, touching Tristan, a Romance, by Zoe. "Hardly," said Madge, picking it up with a look of contempt. "I want you to learn English, and not a confusion of tongues like this thing. But it's too hot for lessons, Sal," she went on, leaning back in her seat, "so get a chair and talk to me." Sal complied, and Madge looked out at the brilliant flower-beds, and at the black shadow of the tall wych-elm which grew on one side of the lawn. She wanted to ask a certain question of Sal, and did not know how to do it. The moodiness and irritability of Brian had troubled her very much of late, and with the quick instinct of her sex, she ascribed it indirectly to the woman who had died in the back slum. Anxious to share his troubles and lighten his burden, she determined to ask Sal about this mysterious woman, and find out, if possible, what secret had been told to Brian which affected him so deeply. "Sal," she said, after a short pause, turning her clear grey eyes on the woman, "I want to ask you something." The other shivered and turned pale. About that?" Madge nodded. Sal hesitated for a moment, and then flung herself at the feet of her mistress. "I will tell you," she cried. "You have been kind to me, and have a right to know. I will tell you all I know." "Then," asked Madge firmly, as she clasped her hands tightly together, "who was this woman whom Mr. Fitzgerald went to see, and where did she come from?" "Gran and me found her one evening in Little Bourke Street," answered Sal, "just near the theatre. She was quite drunk, and we took her home with us." "Oh, how kind of you!" said Madge. "Oh, it wasn't that," replied the other dryly. "Gran wanted her clothes. She was awful swell dressed." "And she took the clothes! How wicked!" "Any one would have done it down our way," answered Sal indifferently. "But Gran changed her mind when she got her home. I went out to get some gin for Gran, and when I got back she was a-huggin' and a-kissin' the woman." "She recognized her." "Yes, I s'pose so," replied Sal. "And next morning, when the lady got square, she made a grab at Gran and hollered out, 'I was comin' to see you!'" "And then?" "Gran chucked me out of the room, and they had a long jaw, and then when I come back Gran tells me the lady is a-goin' to stay with us 'cause she was ill, and sent me for Mr. White." "And he came?" "Oh, yes, often," said Sal. "He kicked up a row when he first turned up, but when he found she was ill he sent a doctor, but it weren't no good. She was 2 weeks with us, and then died the morning she saw Mr. Fitzgerald." "I suppose Mr. White was in the habit of talking to this woman?" "Lots," returned Sal, "but he always turned Gran and me out of the room afore he started." "And," hesitating, "did you ever overhear one of those conversations?" "Yes, one," answered the other with a nod. "I got riled at the way he cleared us out of our own room, and once when he shut the door and Gran went off to get some gin, I sat down at the door and listened. He wanted her to give up some papers, and she wouldn't. She said she'd die first, but at last he got 'em and took 'em away with him." "Did you see them?" asked Madge, as the assertion of Gorby that White had been murdered for certain papers flashed across her mind. "Rather," said Sal. "I was looking through a hole in the door, and she takes 'em from under her pillar, and he takes 'em to the table, where the candle was, and looks at 'em. They were in a large blue envelope, with writing on it in red ink. Then he put 'em in his pocket, and she sings out, 'You'll lose 'em,' and he says, 'No, I'll always have 'em with me, and if he wants 'em he'll have to kill me fust afore he gets 'em.'" "And you did not know who the man was to whom the papers were of such importance?" "No, I didn't. They never said no names." "And when was it White got the papers?" "About a week before he was murdered," said Sal, after a moment's thought. "And after that he never turned up again. She kept watchin' for him night and day, and 'cause he didn't come, got mad at him. I hear her sayin', 'You think you've done with me, my gentleman, and leaves me here to die, but I'll spoil your little game.' And then she wrote that letter to Mr. Fitzgerald, and I brought him to her, as you know." "Yes, yes," said Madge, rather impatiently. "I heard all that at the trial. But what conversation passed between Mr. Fitzgerald and this woman? Did you hear it?" "Bits of it," replied the other. "I didn't split in court, 'cause I thought the lawyer would be down on me for listening. The first thing I heard Mr. Fitzgerald sayin' was, 'You're mad, it ain't true,' and she says, 'S'elp me it is, White's got the proof.' And then he sings out, 'My poor girl,' and she says, 'Will you marry her now?' and says he, 'I will, I love her more than ever.' And then she makes a grab at him, and says, 'Spoil his game if you can,' and says he, 'What's your name?' and she says—" "What?" asked Madge, breathlessly. "Rosanna Moore." There was a sharp exclamation as Sal said the name, and turning round quickly, Madge found Brian standing beside her, pale as death, with his eyes fixed on the woman, who had risen to her feet. "Go on," he said sharply. "That's all I know," she replied in a sullen tone. Brian gave a sigh of relief. "You can go," he said slowly. "I wish to speak with Miss Frettlby alone." Sal looked at him for a moment, and then glanced at her mistress, who nodded to her as a sign that she might withdraw. She picked up her book, and with another sharp, inquiring look at Brian, turned and walked slowly into the house. Chapter 21. For more free audiobooks or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 22. Of Mystery of a Hansom Cab by Fergus Hume. A Daughter of Eve. After Sal had gone, Brian sank into a chair beside Madge with a weary sigh. He was in riding dress, which became his stalwart figure well, and he looked remarkably handsome but ill and worried. "What on earth were you questioning that girl about?" he said abruptly, taking his hat off and tossing it and his gloves on to the floor. Madge flushed crimson for a moment, and then taking Brian's two strong hands in her own, looked steadily into his frowning face. "Why don't you trust me?" she asked in a quiet tone. "It is not necessary that I should," he answered moodily. "The secret that Rosanna Moore told me on her deathbed is nothing that would benefit you to know." "Is it about me?" she persisted. "It is, and it is not," he answered epigrammatically. "I suppose that means that it is about a third person, and concerns me," she said calmly, releasing his hands. "Well, yes," impatiently striking his boot with his riding-whip. "But it is nothing that can harm you so long as you do not know it. But God help you should anyone tell it to you, for it would embitter your life." "My life being so very sweet now," answered Madge, with a slight sneer. "You are trying to put out a fire by pouring oil on it, and what you say only makes me more determined to learn what it is." "Madge, I implore you not to persist in this foolish curiosity," he said almost fiercely. "It will bring you only misery." "If it concerns me, I have a right to know it," she answered curtly. "When I marry you, how can we be happy together, with the shadow of a secret between us?" Brian rose, and leaned against the veranda post with a dark frown on his face. "Do you remember that verse of Browning's?" he said, coolly. "Where the apple reddens, never pry, lest we lose our Edens, Eve and I." Singularly applicable to our present conversation, I think. "Ah!" she said, her pale face flushing with anger. "You want me to live in a fool's paradise, which may end at any moment." "That depends upon yourself," he answered coldly. "I never roused your curiosity by telling you that there was a secret, but betrayed it inadvertently to Calton's cross-questioning. I tell you candidly that I did learn something from Rosanna Moore, and it concerns you, though only indirectly through a third person. But it would do no good to reveal it, and would ruin both our lives." She did not answer, but looked straight before her into the glowing sunshine. Brian fell on his knees beside her, and stretched out his hands with an entreating gesture. "Oh, my darling," he cried sadly, "cannot you trust me? The love which has stood such a test as yours cannot fail like this. Let me bear the misery of knowing it alone, without blighting your young life with the knowledge of it. I would tell you if I could, but, God help me, I cannot, I cannot." And he buried his face in his hands. Madge closed her mouth firmly, and touched his comely head with her cool white fingers. There was a struggle going on in her breast between her feminine curiosity and her love for the man at her feet. The latter conquered, and she bowed her head over his. "Brian," she whispered softly, "let it be as you wish. I will never again try to learn this secret, since you do not desire it." He arose to his feet, and caught her in his strong arms, with a glad smile. "My dearest!" he said, kissing her passionately, and then for a few moments neither of them spoke. "We will begin a new life," he said at length. "We will put the sad past away from us, and think of it only as a dream." "But this secret will still fret you," she murmured. "It will wear away with time, and with change of scene," he answered sadly. "Change of scene!" she repeated in a startled tone. "Are you going away?" "Yes. I've sold my station, and intend leaving Australia for ever, during the next 3 months." "And where are you going?" asked the girl, rather bewildered. "Anywhere," he said a little bitterly. "I am going to follow the example of Cain, and be a wanderer on the face of the earth." "Alone?" "That is what I have come to see you about," said Brian, looking steadily at her. "I have come to ask if you will marry me at once, and we will leave Australia together." She hesitated. "I know it is asking a great deal," he said hurriedly, "to leave your friends, your position, and," with hesitation, "your father, but think of my life without you. Think how lonely I shall be, wandering round the world by myself. But you will not desert me now I have so much need of you. You will come with me and be my good angel in the future as you have been in the past?" She put her hand on his arm, and looking at him with her clear grey eyes, said, "Yes." "Thank God for that," said Brian reverently, and there was again a silence. Then they sat down and talked about their plans, and built castles in the air after the fashion of lovers. "I wonder what papa will say," observed Madge, idly twisting her engagement ring round and round. Brian frowned, and a dark look passed over his face. "I suppose I must speak to him about it," he said at length, reluctantly. "Yes, of course," she replied lightly. "It is merely a formality, still one that must be observed." "And where is Mr. Frettlby?" asked Fitzgerald, rising. "In the billiard room," she answered, as she followed his example. "No," she continued, as she saw her father step on to the verandah. "Here he is." Brian had not seen Mark Frettlby for some time, and was astonished at the change which had taken place in his appearance. Formerly he had been as straight as an arrow, with a stern, fresh-coloured face, but now he had a slight stoop, and his face looked old and withered. His thick black hair was streaked here and there with white. His eyes alone were unchanged. They were as keen and bright as ever. Brian knew full well how he himself had altered. He knew, too, that Madge was not the same, and now he could not but wonder whether the great change that was apparent in her father was attributed to the same source, to the murder of Oliver White. Sad and thoughtful as Mr. Frettlby looked, as he came along, a smile broke over his face as he caught sight of his daughter. "My dear Fitzgerald," he said, holding out his hand, "this is indeed a surprise. When did you come over?" "About half an hour ago," replied Brian, reluctantly, taking the extended hand of the millionaire. "I came to see Madge, and have a talk with you." "Ah, that's right," said the other, putting his arm round his daughter's waist. "So that's what has brought the roses to your face, young lady," he went on, pinching her cheek playfully. "You will stay to dinner, of course, Fitzgerald." "Thank you, no," answered Brian, hastily. "My dress—" "Nonsense!" interrupted Frettlby, hospitably. "We are not in Melbourne, and I am sure Madge will excuse your dress. You must stay." "Yes, do," said Madge, in a beseeching tone, touching his hand lightly. "I don't see so much of you that I can let you off with half an hour's conversation." Brian seemed to be making a violent effort. "Very well," he said in a low voice, "I shall stay." "And now," said Frettlby in a brisk tone, as he sat down, "the important question of dinner being settled, what is it you want to see me about? Your station?" "No," answered Brian, leaning against the verandah post, while Madge slipped her hand through his arm. "I've sold it." "Sold it!" echoed Frettlby, aghast. "What for?" "I felt restless, and wanted a change." "Ah, a rolling stone," said the millionaire, shaking his head, "gathers no moss, you know." "Stones don't roll of their own accord," replied Brian, in a gloomy tone. "They are impelled by a force over which they have no control." "Oh, indeed!" said the millionaire in a joking tone. "And may I ask what is your propelling force?" Brian looked at the man's face with such a steady gaze that the latter's eyes dropped after an uneasy attempt to return it. "Well," he said impatiently, looking at the two tall young people standing before him, "what do you want to see me about?" "Madge has agreed to marry me at once, and I want your consent." "Impossible," said Frettlby curtly. "There is no such a word as impossible," retorted Brian coolly, thinking of the famous remark in Richelieu. "Why should you refuse? I am rich now." "Pshaw!" said Frettlby, rising impatiently. "It's not money I'm thinking about. I've got enough for both of you, but I cannot live without Madge." "Then come with us," said his daughter, kissing him. Her lover, however, did not second the invitation, but stood moodily twisting his tawny moustache, and staring out into the garden in an absent sort of manner. "What do you say, Fitzgerald?" said Frettlby, who was eyeing him keenly. "Oh, delighted, of course," answered Brian, confusedly. "In that case," returned the other, coolly, "I will tell you what we will do. I've bought a steam yacht, and she will be ready for sea about the end of January. You will marry my daughter at once, and go round New Zealand for your honeymoon. When you return, if I feel inclined, and you two turtle doves don't object, I will join you, and we will make a tour of the world." "Oh, how delightful!" cried Madge, clasping her hands. "I am so fond of the ocean, with a companion, of course," she added, with a saucy glance at her lover. Brian's face had brightened considerably, for he was a born sailor, and a pleasant yachting voyage in the blue waters of the Pacific, with Madge as his companion, was to his mind as near paradise as any mortal could get. "And what is the name of the yacht?" he asked, with deep interest. "Her name?" repeated Mr. Frettlby, hastily. "Oh, a very ugly name, and one which I intend to change. At present she is called the Rosanna." "Rosanna!" Brian and his betrothed both started at this, and the former stared curiously at the old man, wondering at the coincidence between the name of the yacht and that of the woman who died in the Melbourne slum. Mr. Frettlby flushed a little when he saw Brian's eyes fixed on him with such an inquiring gaze, and rose with an embarrassed laugh. "You are a pair of moon-struck lovers," he said, gaily, taking an arm of each and leading them into the house. "But you forget dinner will be ready soon." Chapter 22. Read by Sibella Denton. For more free audiobooks or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 23 of Mystery of a Hansom Cab by Fergus Hume. Read for LibriVox.org into the public domain. Across the walnuts and the wine. Moore, sweetest of bards, sings, "Oh, there's nothing half so sweet in life as love's young dream." But he made this assertion in his callow days, before he had learned the value of a good digestion. To a young and fervid youth, love's young dream is, no doubt, very charming, lovers, as a rule, having a small appetite; but to a man who has seen the world, and drunk deeply of the wine of life, there is nothing half so sweet in the whole of his existence as a good dinner. A hard heart and a good digestion will make any man happy. So said Talleyrand, a cynic if you like, but a man who knew the temper of his day and generation. Ovid wrote about the art of love, brilliant Savarin of the art of dining, yet, I warrant you, the gastronomical treatise of the brilliant Frenchman is more widely read than the passionate songs of the Roman poet. Who does not value as the sweetest, in the whole 24, the hour when, seated at an artistically laid table, with delicately cooked viands, good wine, and pleasant company, all the cares and worries of the day give place to a delightful sense of absolute enjoyment? Dinner with the English people is generally a very dreary affair, and there is a heaviness about the whole thing which communicates itself to the guests, who eat and drink with a solemn persistence, as though they were occupied in fulfilling some sacred rite. But there are men, alas, few and far between, who possess the rare art of giving good dinners, good in the sense of sociality as well as in that of cookery. Mark Frettlby was one of these rare individuals. He had an innate genius for getting pleasant people together, people who, so to speak, dovetailed into one another. He had an excellent cook, and his wines were irreproachable, so that Brian, in spite of his worries, was glad that he had accepted the invitation. The bright gleam of the silver, the glitter of glass, and the perfume of flowers, all collected under the subdued crimson glow of a pink-shaded lamp, which hung from the ceiling, could not but give him a pleasurable sensation. On one side of the dining-room were the French windows opening onto the verandah, and beyond appeared the vivid green of the trees, and the dazzling colours of the flowers, somewhat tempered by the soft, hazy glow of the twilight. Brian had made himself as respectable as possible under the odd circumstances of dining in his riding dress, and sat next to Madge, contentedly sipping his wine, and listening to the pleasant chatter which was going on around him. Felix Rolleston was in great spirits, the more so as Mrs. Rolleston was at the further end of the table, hidden from his view. Julia Featherweight sat near Mr. Frettlby, and chatted to him so persistently that he wished she would become possessed of a dumb devil. Dr. Chinston and Peterson were seated on the other side of the table, and the old colonist, whose name was Valpy, had the post of honour on Mr. Frettlby's right hand. The conversation had turned on to the subject, ever green and fascinating, of politics, and Mr. Rolleston thought it a good opportunity to air his views as to the government of the colony, and to show his wife that he really meant to obey her wish and become a power in the political world. "By Jove, you know," he said, with a wave of his hand, as though he were addressing the House, "the country is going to the dogs, and all that sort of thing. What we want is a man like Beaconsfield." "Ah, but you can't pick up a man like that every day," said Frettlby, who was listening with an amused smile to Rolleston's disquisitions. "Rather a good thing, too," observed Dr. Chinston, dryly. "Genius would become too common. Well, when I am elected," said Felix, who had his own views, which modesty forbade him to publish, on the subject of the coming colonial Disraeli, "I probably shall form a party." "To advocate what?" asked Peterson, curiously. "Oh, well, you see," hesitated Felix, "I haven't drawn up a programme yet, so I can't say at present." "Yes, you can hardly give a performance without a programme," said the doctor, taking a sip of wine, and then everybody laughed. "And on what are your political opinions founded?" asked Mr. Frettlby, absently, without looking at Felix. "Oh, you see, I've read the Parliamentary Reports and Constitutional History, and Vivian Grey," said Felix, who began to feel himself somewhat at sea. "The last of which is what the author called it, a lusus naturae," observed Chinston. "Don't erect your political schemes on such bubble foundations as are in that novel, for you won't find a Marquise Carabas out here." "Unfortunately, no," observed Felix, mournfully, "but we may find a Vivian Grey." Every one smothered a smile, the illusion was so patent. "Well, he didn't succeed in the end," cried Peterson. "Of course he didn't," retorted Felix, disdainfully. "He made an enemy of a woman, and a man who is such a fool as to do that deserves to fall." "You have an excellent opinion of our sex, Mr. Rolleston," said Madge, with a wicked glance at the wife of that gentleman, who was listening complacently to her husband's aimless chatter. "No better than they deserve," replied Rolleston, gallantly. "But you have never gone in for politics, Mr. Frettlby?" "Who? I? No," said the host, rousing himself out of the brown study into which he had fallen. "I'm afraid I'm not sufficiently patriotic, and my business did not permit me." "And now?" "Now," echoed Mr. Frettlby, glancing at his daughter, "I intend to travel." "The jolliest thing out," said Peterson, eagerly. "One never gets tired of seeing the queer things that are in the world." "I've seen queer enough things in Melbourne in the early days," said the old colonist, with a wicked twinkle in his eyes. "Oh!" cried Julia, putting her hands up to his ears. "Don't dare tell me them, for I'm sure they're naughty." "We weren't saints then," said old Valpy, with a senile chuckle. "Ah, then we haven't changed much in that respect," retorted Frettlby, dryly. "You talk of your old theatres now," went on Valpy, with the garrulousness of old age. "Why, you haven't got a dancer like Rosanna." Brian started on hearing this name again, and he felt Madge's cold hand touch his. "And who was Rosanna?" asked Felix, curiously, looking up. "A dancer and a burlesque actress," replied Valpy, vivaciously, nodding his old head. "Such a beauty! We were all mad about her. Such hair and eyes! You remember her, Frettlby?" "Yes," answered the host, in a curiously dry voice. But before Mr. Valpy had the opportunity to wax more eloquent, Madge rose from the table, and the other ladies followed. The ever-polite Felix held the door open for them, and received a bright smile from his wife, for what she considered his brilliant talk at the dinner-table. Brian sat still, and wondered why Frettlby changed colour on hearing the name. He supposed that the millionaire had been mixed up with the actress, and did not care about being reminded of his early indiscretions. And after all, who does? "She was as light as a fairy," continued Valpy, with a wicked chuckle. "What became of her?" asked Brian, abruptly. Mark Frettlby looked up suddenly, as Fitzgerald asked this question. "She went to England in 1858, said the aged one. "I'm not quite sure if it was July or August, but it was 1858. "You will excuse me, Valpy, but I hardly think these reminiscences of a ballet dancer are amusing," said Frettlby, curtly, pouring himself out a glass of wine. "Let us change the subject." Notwithstanding the plainly expressed wish of his host, Brian felt strongly inclined to pursue the conversation. Politeness, however, forbade such a thing, and he consoled himself with the reflection that, after dinner, he would ask old Valpy about the ballet dancer whose name caused Mark Frettlby to exhibit such strong emotion. But to his annoyance, when the gentlemen went into the drawing-room, Frettlby took the old colonist off to his study, where he sat with him the whole evening, talking over old times. Fitzgerald found Madge seated at the piano in the drawing-room, playing one of Mendelssohn's Songs Without Words. "What a dismal thing that is you are playing, Madge," he said lightly, as he sank into a seat beside her. "It is more like a funeral march than anything else." "Gad, so it is," said Felix, who came up at this moment. "I don't care myself about Op. 84 and all that classical humbug. Give me something light, Belle Helena, with Emile Melville and all that sort of thing." "Felix!" said his wife in a stern tone. "My dear," he answered recklessly, rendered bold by the champagne he had taken, "you observed—" "Nothing particular," answered Mrs. Rolleston, glancing at him with a stony eye, "except that I consider Offenbach low." "I don't," said Felix, sitting down to the piano, from which Madge had just risen, "and to prove he ain't, here goes." He ran his fingers lightly over the keys, and dashed into a brilliant Offenbach galop, which had the effect of waking up the people in the drawing-room, who felt sleepy after dinner, and sent the blood tingling through their veins. When they were thoroughly roused, Felix, now that he had an appreciative audience, for he was by no means an individual who believed in wasting his sweetness on the desert air, prepared to amuse them. "You haven't heard the last new song by Frosty, have you?" he asked, after he had brought his galop to a conclusion. "Is that the composer of Inasmuch and How So?" asked Julia, clasping her hands. "I do love his music, and the words are so sweetly pretty." "Infernally stupid, she means," whispered Peterson to Brian. "They've no more meaning in them than the titles." "Sing us the new song, Felix," commanded his wife, and her obedient husband obeyed her. It was entitled Somewhere, words by Vashti, music by Paolo Frosti, and was one of those extraordinary compositions which may mean anything, that is, if the meaning can be discovered. Felix had a pleasant voice, though it was not very strong, and the music was pretty, while the words were mystical. The first verse was as follows: "A flying cloud, a breaking wave, a faint light in a moonless sky, a voice from the silent grave, sounds sad in one long, bitter cry. I know not, sweet, where you may stand, with shining eyes and golden hair, yet I know I will touch your hand, and kiss your lips somewhere, 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 when the summer sun is fair, waiting on me on land or sea, somewhere, love, somewhere." The second verse was very similar to the first, and when Felix finished a murmur of applause broke from every one of the ladies. "How sweetly pretty!" sighed Julia. "Such a lot in it." "But what is its meaning?" asked Brian, rather bewildered. "It hasn't got one," replied Felix complacently. "Surely you don't want every song to have a moral, like a book of Aesop's fables." Brian shrugged his shoulders and turned away with Madge. "I must say I agree with Fitzgerald," said the doctor quickly. "I like a song with some meaning in it. The poetry of the one you sang is as mystical as Browning, without any of his genius to redeem it." "Philistine," murmured Felix under his breath, and then vacated his seat at the piano in favour of Julia, who was about to sing a ballad called "Going Down the Hill," which had been the rage in Melbourne musical circles during the last 2 months. Meanwhile Madge and Brian were walking up and down in the moonlight. It was an exquisite night, with a cloudless blue sky glittering with the stars, and a great yellow moon in the west. Madge seated herself on the side of the marble ledge which girdled the still pool of water in front of the house, and dipped her hand into the cool water. Brian leaned against the trunk of a great magnolia tree, whose glossy green leaves and great creamy blossoms looked fantastic in the moonlight. In front of them was the house, with the ruddy lamplight streaming through the wide windows, and they could see the guests within, excited by the music, waltzing to Rolleston's playing, and their dark figures kept passing and repassing the windows, while the charming music of the waltz mingled with their merry laughter. "Looks like a haunted house," said Brian, thinking of Poe's weird poem, "but such a thing is impossible out here." "I don't know so much about that," said Madge gravely, lifting up some water in the palm of her hand, and letting it stream back like diamonds in the moonlight. "I knew a house in St. Kilda which was haunted." "By what?" asked Brian sceptically. "Noises," she answered solemnly. Brian burst out laughing, and startled a bat, which flew round and round in the silver moonlight, and whirled away into the shelter of a wych-elm. "Rats and mice are more common here than ghosts," he said lightly. "I'm afraid the inhabitants of your haunted house were fanciful." "So you don't believe in ghosts?" "There's a banshee in our family," said Brian, with a gay smile, "who is supposed to cheer our death-beds with her howlings, but as I've never seen the lady myself, I'm afraid she's a Mrs. Harris." "It's aristocratic to have a ghost in a family, I believe," said Madge. "That is the reason we colonials have none." "Ah, but you will have," he answered with a careless laugh. "There are no doubt democratic as well as aristocratic ghosts, but pshaw!" he went on impatiently, "what nonsense I talk! There are no ghosts except of a man's own raising. The ghosts of a dead youth, the ghosts of past follies, the ghosts of what might have been, these are the spectres which are more to be feared than those of the churchyard." Madge looked at him in silence, for she understood the meaning of that passionate outburst, the secret which the dead woman had told him, and which hung like a shadow over his life. She arose quietly and took his arm. The light touch roused him, and a faint wind sent an eerie rustle through the still leaves of the magnolia as they walked back in silence to the house. Chapter 23. For more free audiobooks or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 24 of Mystery of a Hansom Cab by Fergus Hume. Read for LibriVox.org into the public domain. Brian receives a letter. Notwithstanding the hospitable invitation of Mr. Frettlby, Brian refused to stay at Yabbayallook that night, but after saying good-bye to Madge, mounted his horse and rode slowly away in the moonlight. He felt very happy, and letting the reins lie loose on his horse's neck, he gave himself up unreservedly to his thoughts. Atra Cura certainly did not sit behind the horseman on this night, and Brian, to his surprise, found himself singing Kitty of Coleraine as he rode along in the silver moonlight. And was he not right to sing when the future seemed so bright and pleasant? Oh yes, they would live on the ocean, and she would find how much pleasanter it was on the restless waters, with their solemn sense of mystery, than on the crowded land. Was not the sea made for the free, land of courts and slaves alone? Moore was perfectly right. She would learn that when, with a fair wind, and all sail set, they were flying over the blue Pacific waters. And then they would go home to Ireland, to the ancestral home of the Fitzgeralds, where he would lead her in under the arch, with Céad Míle Fáilte on it, and every one would bless the fair young bride. Why should he trouble himself about the crime of another? No, he had made a resolve, and intended to keep it. He would put this secret with which he had been entrusted behind his back, and would wander about the world with Madge and her father. He felt a sudden chill come over him as he murmured the last words to himself. Her father. "I'm a fool," he said impatiently, as he gathered up the reins, and spurred his horse into a canter. "It can make no difference to me so long as Madge remains ignorant, but to sit beside him, to eat with him, to have him always present like a skeleton at a feast, God help me!" He urged his horse into a gallop, and as he rushed over the turf, with the fresh cool night wind blowing keenly against his face, he felt a sense of relief, as though he were leaving some dark spectre behind. On he galloped, with the blood throbbing in his young veins, over miles of plain, with the dark blue, star-studded sky above, and the pale moon shining down on him. Past a silent shepherd's hut, which stood near a wide creek, splashing through the cool water, which wound through the dark plain like a thread of silver in the moonlight, then again the wide grassy plain, dotted here and there with tall clumps of shadowy trees, and on either side he could see the sheep scurrying away like fantastic spectres, on, ever on, until his own homestead appears, and he sees the star-like light shining brightly in the distance. A long avenue of tall trees, over whose wavering shadows his horse thundered, and then the wide grassy space in front of the house, with the clamorous barking of dogs. A groom, roused by the clatter of hoofs up the avenue, comes round the side of the house, and Brian leaps off his horse, and flinging the reins to the man, walks into his own room. There he finds a lighted lamp, brandy and soda on the table, and a packet of letters and newspapers. He flung his hat on the sofa, and opened the window and door, so as to let in the cool breeze. Then, mixing for himself a glass of brandy and soda, he turned up the lamp, and prepared to read his letters. The first he took up was from a lady. "Always a she correspondent for me," says Isaac Disraeli, "provided she does not cross." Brian's correspondence did not cross, but notwithstanding this, after reading half a page of small talk and scandal, he flung the letter on the table with an impatient ejaculation. The other letters were principally business ones, but the last one proved to be from Calton, and Fitzgerald opened it with a sensation of pleasure. Calton was a capital letter-writer, and his epistles had done much to cheer Fitzgerald in the dismal period which succeeded his acquittal of White's murder, when he was in danger of getting into a morbid state of mind. Brian, therefore, sipped his brandy and soda, and lying back in his chair, prepared to enjoy himself. "My dear Fitzgerald," wrote Calton in his peculiarly clear handwriting, which was such an exception to the usual crabbed hieroglyphics of his brethren of the bar, "while you are enjoying the cool breezes and delightful freshness of the country, here am I, with numerous other poor devils, cooped up in this hot and dusty city. How I wish I were with you in the land of Goshen, by the rolling waters of the Murray, where everything is bright and green, and unsophisticated. The two latter terms are almost identical, instead of which my view is bounded by bricks and mortar, and the muddy waters of the Yarra have to do duty for your noble river. Ah! too long I have lived in Acadia, but I don't now, and even if some power gave me the choice to go back again, I am not sure that I would accept. Arcadia, after all, is a lotus-eating paradise of blissful ignorance, and I love the world with its pomps, vanities, and wickedness. While you, therefore, O Corydon, don't be afraid, I'm not going to quote Virgil, are studying Nature's book, I am deep in the musty leaves of Themis's volume, but I dare say that the Great Mother teaches you much better things than her artificial daughter does me. However, you remember that pithy proverb, when one is in Rome, one must not speak ill of the Pope, so being in the legal profession, I must respect its muse. I suppose when you saw that this letter came from a law office, you wondered what the deuce a lawyer was writing to you for, and my handwriting no doubt suggested a writ. Pshaw! I am wrong there, you are past the age of writs. Not that I hint that you are old, by no means. You are just at that appreciative age when a man enjoys life most, when the fire of youth is tempered by the experience of age, and one knows how to enjoy the utmost good things of this world, viz., love, wine, and friendship. I am afraid I am growing poetical, which is a bad thing for a lawyer, for the flower of poetry cannot flourish in the arid wastes of the law. On reading what I have written, I find I have been as discursive as Praed's vicar, and as this letter is supposed to be a business one, I must deny myself the luxury of following out a train of idle ideas and right sense. I suppose you still hold the secret which Rosanna Moore entrusted with you. Ah! you see I know her name, and why? Simply because, with the natural curiosity of the human race, I have been trying to find out who murdered Oliver White, and as the Argus very cleverly pointed out, Rosanna Moore, as likely to be at the bottom of the whole affair, I have been learning her past history. The secret of White's murder, and the reason for it, is known to you, but you refuse, even in the interests of justice, to reveal it. Why, I don't know, but we all have our little faults, and from an amiable though mistaken sense of, shall I say duty, you refuse to deliver up the man whose cowardly crime so nearly cost you your life. After your departure from Melbourne everyone said, "The Hansom Cab tragedy is at an end, and the murderer will never be discovered." I ventured to disagree with the wiseacres who made such a remark, and asked myself, who was this woman who died at Mother Guttersnipe's? Receiving no satisfactory answer for myself, I determined to find out, and took steps accordingly. In the first place, I learned from Roger Morland, who, if you remember, was a witness against you at the trial, that White and Rosanna Moore had come out to Sydney on the John Elder about a year ago as Mr. and Mrs. White. I need hardly say that they did not think it needful to go through the formality of marriage, as such a time might have been found inconvenient on some future occasion. Morland knew nothing about Rosanna Moore, and advised me to give up the search, as coming from a city like London it would be difficult to find any one that knew her there. Notwithstanding this, I telegraphed home to a friend of mine, who is a bit of an amateur detective, find out the name and all about the woman who left England on the John Elder on the 21st day of August, 18, as wife of Oliver White. Mirabile dictu, he found out all about her, and knowing as you do what a maelstrom of humanity London is, you must admit my friend was clever. It appears, however, that the task I set him was easier than he expected, for the so-called Mrs. White was rather a notorious individual in her own way. She was a burlesque actress at the Frivolity Theatre in London, and being a very handsome woman, had been photographed innumerable times. Consequently, when she very foolishly went with White to choose a berth on board the boat, she was recognized by the clerks in the office as Rosanna Moore, better known as Musette of the Frivolity. Why she ran away with White I cannot tell you. With reference to men understanding women, I refer you to Balzac's remark anent the same. Perhaps Musette got weary of St. John's Wood and champagne suppers, and longed for the purer air of her native land. Ah! you open your eyes at this latter statement. You are surprised. No, on second thoughts you are not, because she told you herself that she was a native of Sydney, and had gone home in 1858, after a triumphant career of acting in Melbourne. And why did she leave the applauding Melbourne public and the flesh-pots of Egypt? You know this also. She ran away with a rich young squatter, with more money than morals, who happened to be in Melbourne at the time. She seems to have had a weakness for running away. But why she chose White to go with this time puzzles me. He was not rich, not particularly good-looking, had no position and a bad temper. How do I know all these traits of Mr. White's character, morally and socially? Easily enough. My omniscient friend found them all out. Mr. White was the son of a London tailor, and his father being well off retired into a private life, and ultimately went the way of all flesh. His son, finding himself with a capital income, and a pretty taste for amusement, cut the shop of his late lamented parent, found out that his family had come over with the Conqueror, Glanville de White helped to sew the Bayeux tapestry, I suppose, and graduated at the Frivolity Theatre as a masher. In common with the other gilded youth of the day, he worshipped at the gas-lit shrine of Musette, and the goddess, pleased with his incense, left her other admirers in the lurch, and ran off with fortunate Mr. White. So far as this goes, there is nothing to show why the murder was committed. Men do not perpetrate crimes for the sake of the light of loves like Musette, unless, indeed, some wretched youth embezzles money to buy jewellery for his divinity. The career of Musette in London was simply that of a clever member of the demi-monde, and, as far as I can learn, no one was so much in love with her as to commit a crime for her sake. So far, so good. The motive of the crime must be found in Australia. White had spent nearly all his money in England, and consequently Musette and her lover arrived in Sydney with comparatively very little cash. However, with an Epicurean-like philosophy, they enjoyed themselves on what little they had, and then came to Melbourne, where they stayed at a second-rate hotel. Musette, I may tell you, had one special vice, a common one, drink. She loved champagne, and drank a good deal of it. Consequently, on arriving at Melbourne, and not finding that a new generation had arisen which knew not Musette, she drowned her sorrows in the flowing bowl, and went out after a quarrel with Mr. White, to view Melbourne by night. A familiar scene to her, no doubt. What took her to Little Bourke Street I don't know. Perhaps she got lost, perhaps it had been a favourite walk of hers in the old days. At all events, she was found dead drunk in that unsavoury locality by Sal Rawlins. I know this is so, because Sal told me so herself. Sal acted the part of the Good Samaritan, took her to the squalid den she called home, and there Rosanna Moore fell dangerously ill. White, who had missed her, found out where she was, and that she was too ill to be removed. I presume he was rather glad to get rid of such an encumbrance, so he went back to his lodgings at St. Kilda, which, judging from the landlady's story, he must have occupied for some time, while Rosanna Moore was drinking herself to death in a quiet hotel. Still, he does not break off his connection with the dying woman, but one night is murdered in a hansom cab, and that same night Rosanna Moore dies. So, from all appearances, everything is ended. Not so, for before dying Rosanna sends for Brian Fitzgerald at his club, and reveals to him a secret which he locks up in his own heart. The writer of this letter has a theory, a fanciful one if you will, that the secret told to Brian Fitzgerald contains the mystery of Oliver White's death. Now then, have I not found out a good deal without you, and do you still decline to reveal the rest? I do not say you know who killed White, but I do say you know sufficient to lead to the detection of the murderer. If you tell me, so much the better, both for your own sense of justice and for your peace of mind. If you do not, well, I shall find out without you. I have taken, and still take, a great interest in this strange case, and I have sworn to bring the murderer to justice, so I make this last appeal to you to tell me what you know. If you refuse, I will set to work to find out all about Rosanna Moore prior to her departure from Australia in 1858, and I am certain sooner or later to discover the secret which led to White's murder. If there is any strong reason why it should be kept silent, I perhaps will come round to your view, and let the matter drop. But if I have to find it out myself, the murderer of Oliver White need expect no mercy at my hands. So think over what I have said. If I do not hear from you within the next week, I shall regard your decision as final, and pursue the search myself. I am sure, my dear Fitzgerald, you will find this letter too long, in spite of the interesting story it contains, so I will have pity on you and draw to a close. Remember me to Miss Frettlby and to her father. With kind regards to yourself, I remain, yours very truly, Duncan Calton. When Fitzgerald had finished the last of the closely written sheets, he let the letter fall from his hands, and leaning back in his chair, stared blankly into the dawning light outside. He arose after a few moments, and pouring himself out a glass of brandy, drank it quickly. Then, mechanically lighting a cigar, he stepped out of the door into the fresh beauty of the dawn. There was a soft crimson glow in the east, which announced the approach of the sun, and he could hear the chirping of the awakening birds in the trees. But Brian did not see the marvellous breaking of the dawn. He stood staring at the red light flaring in the east, and thinking of Calton's letter. "I can do no more," he said bitterly, leaning his head against the wall of the house. "There is only one way of stopping Calton, and that is by telling him all. My poor Madge, my poor Madge." A soft wind arose and rustled among the trees, and there appeared great shafts of crimson light in the east. Then, with a sudden blaze, the sun peered over the brim of the wide plain. The warm yellow rays touched lightly the comely head of the weary man, and turning round, he held up his arms to the great luminary, as though he were a fire worshipper. "I accept the omen of the dawn," he cried, "for her life and for mine." Chapter 24. Read by Sibella Denton. For more free audiobooks or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 25 of Mystery of a Hansom Cab by Fergus Hume. Read for LibriVox.org into the public domain. What Dr. Chinston Said. His resolution taken, Brian did not let the grass grow under his feet, but rode over in the afternoon to tell Madge of his intended departure. The servant told him she was in the garden, so he went there, and, guided by the sound of merry voices, and the laughter of pretty women, soon found his way to the lawn-tennis ground. Madge and her guests were there, seated under the shade of a great wych-elm, and watching with great interest a single-handed match being played between Rolleston and Peterson, both of whom were capital players. Mr. Frettlby was not present. He was inside writing letters, and talking with old Mr. Valpy, and Brian gave a sigh of relief as he noted his absence. Madge caught sight of him as he came down the garden path, and flew quickly towards him with outstretched hands, as he took his hat off. "How good of you to come," she said in a delighted tone, as she took his arm, "and on such a hot day." "Yes, it's something fearful in this shade," said pretty Mrs. Rolleston, with a laugh, putting up her sunshade. "Pardon me if I think the contrary," replied Fitzgerald, bowing, with an expressive look at the charming group of ladies under the great tree. Mrs. Rolleston blushed and shook her head. "Ah, it's easy to see you came from Ireland, Mr. Fitzgerald," she observed, as she resumed her seat. "You are making Madge jealous." "So he is," answered Madge, with a gay laugh. "I shall certainly inform Mr. Rolleston about you, Brian, if you make these gallant remarks." "Here he comes, then," said her lover, as Rolleston and Peterson, having finished their game, walked off the tennis ground, and joined the group under the tree. Though in tennis flannels, they both looked remarkably warm, and throwing aside his racket, Mr. Rolleston sat down, with a sigh of relief. "Thank goodness it's over, and that I've won," he said, wiping his heated brow. "Galley slaves couldn't have worked harder than we have done, while all you idle folks sat sub tegemi fagi." "Which means?" asked his wife, lazily. "That onlookers see most of the game," answered her husband, impudently. "I suppose that's what you call a free and easy translation," said Peterson, laughing. "Mrs. Rolleston ought to give you something for your new and original adaptation of Virgil." "Let it be iced, then," retorted Rolleston, lying full length on the ground, and staring up at the blue of the sky as seen through the network of leaves. "I always like my something iced." "It's a way you've got," said Madge, with a laugh, as she gave him a glass filled with some sparkling, golden-coloured liquor, with a lump of ice clinking musically against the side of it. "He's not the only one who's got that way," said Peterson gaily, when he had been similarly supplied. "It's a way we've got in the army, it's a way we've got in the navy, it's a way we've got in the varsity. And so say all of us," finished Rolleston, and holding out his glass to be replenished. "I'll have another, please. Whew, it is hot." "What, the drink?" asked Julia, with a giggle. "No, the day," answered Felix, making a face at her. "It's the kind of day one feels inclined to adopt Sydney Smith's advice, by getting out of one's skin, and letting the wind whistle through one's bones." "With such a hot wind blowing," said Peterson gravely, "I'm afraid they'd soon be broiled bones." "Go, giddy one," retorted Felix, throwing his hat at him, "or I'll drag you into the blazing sun, and make you play another game." "Not I," replied Peterson coolly. "Not being a salamander, I'm hardly used to your climate yet, and there is a limit even to lawn tennis." And turning his back on Rolleston, he began to talk to Julia Featherweight. Meanwhile, Madge and her lover, leaving all this frivolous chatter behind them, were walking slowly towards the house, and Brian was telling her of his approaching departure, though not of his reasons for it. "I received a letter last night," he said, turning his face away from her, "and as it's about some important business, I must start at once." "I don't think it will be long before we follow," answered Madge, thoughtfully. "Papa leaves here at the end of the week." "Why?" I'm sure I don't know," said Madge petulantly. "He is so restless, and never seems to settle down to anything. He says for the rest of his life he is going to do nothing but wander all over the world." There suddenly flashed across Fitzgerald's mind a line from Genesis, which seemed singularly applicable to Mr. Frettlby: "A fugitive and a vagabond thou shalt be in the earth." "Every one gets these restless fits sooner or later," he said idly. "In fact," with an uneasy laugh, "I believe I'm in one myself." "That puts me in mind of what I heard Dr. Chinston say yesterday," she said. "This is the age of unrest, as electricity and steam have turned us all into Bohemians." "Ah! Bohemia is a pleasant place," said Brian absently, unconsciously quoting Thackeray, "but we all lose our way to it late in life." "At that rate we won't lose our way to it for some time," she said, laughing, as they stepped into the drawing-room, so cool and shady after the heat and glare outside. As they entered, Mr. Frettlby rose from a chair near the window. He appeared to have been reading, for he held a book in his hand. "What, Fitzgerald!" he exclaimed in a hearty tone, as he held out his hand. "I am glad to see you." "I let you know I am living, don't I?" replied Brian, his face flushing as he reluctantly took the proffered hand. "But the fact is I have come to say good-bye for a few days." "Ah, going back to town, I suppose," said Mr. Frettlby, lying back in his chair and playing with his watch-chain. "I don't know that you are wise, exchanging the clear air of the country for the dusty atmosphere of Melbourne." "Yet Madge tells me you are going back," said Brian idly toying with a vase of flowers on the table. "Depends upon circumstances," replied the other, carelessly. "I may and I may not. You go on business, I presume?" "Well, the fact is, Calton—" Here Brian stopped suddenly, and bit his lip with vexation, for he had not intended to mention the lawyer's name. "Yes?" said Mr. Frettlby, interrogatively, sitting up quickly and looking keenly at Brian. "Wants to see me on business," he finished, awkwardly. "Connected with the sale of your station, I suppose," said Frettlby, still keeping his eyes on the young man's face. "Can't have a better man. Calton's an excellent man of business." "A little too excellent," replied Fitzgerald ruefully. "He's a man who can't leave well enough alone." "Apropos of what?" "Oh, nothing," answered Fitzgerald hastily, and just then his eyes met those of Frettlby. The two men looked at one another steadily for a moment, but in that short space of time a single name flashed through their brains, the name of Rosanna Moore. Mr. Frettlby was the first to lower his eyes and break the spell. "Ah, well," he said lightly as he rose from his chair and held out his hand. "If you are 2 weeks in town, call at St. Kilda, and it's more than likely you will find us there." Brian shook hands in silence, and watched him pick up his hat, and move on to the verandah, and then out into the hot sunshine. "He knows," he muttered involuntarily. "Knows what, sir?" said Madge, who came silently behind him and slipped her arm through his. "That you are hungry, and want something to eat before you leave us?" "I don't feel hungry," said Brian, as they walked towards the door. "Nonsense," answered Madge merrily, who, like Eve, was on hospitable thoughts intent. "I am not going to have you appear in Melbourne a pale, fond lover, as though I were treating you badly. Come, sir. No," she continued, putting up her hand as he tried to kiss her. "Business first, pleasure afterwards," and they went into the dining-room laughing. Mark Frettlby wandered down to the lawn-tennis ground, thinking of the look he had seen in Brian's eyes. He shivered for a moment in the hot sunshine, as though it had grown suddenly chill. "Some one stepping across my grave," he murmured to himself with a cynical smile. "Bah! How superstitious I am, and yet he knows, he knows." "Come on, sir," cried Felix, who had just caught sight of him. "A racket awaits you." Frettlby awoke with a start, and found himself near the lawn-tennis ground, and Felix at his elbow, smoking a cigarette. He roused himself with a great effort, and tapped the young man lightly on the shoulder. "What?" he said with a forced laugh. "Do you really expect me to play lawn-tennis on such a day? You're mad." "I'm hot, you mean," retorted the imperturbable Rolleston, blowing a wreath of smoke. "That's a foregone conclusion," said Dr. Chinston, who came up at that moment. "Such a charming novel!" cried Julia, who had just caught the last remark. "What is?" asked Peterson, rather puzzled. "Howell's book, A Foregone Conclusion," said Julia, also looking puzzled. "Weren't you talking about it?" "I'm afraid this talk is getting slightly incoherent," said Felix, with a sigh. "We all seem madder than usual to-day." "Speak for yourself," said Chinston, indignantly. "I'm as sane as any man in the world." "Exactly," retorted the other coolly. "That's what I say, and you, being a doctor, ought to know that every man and woman in the world is more or less mad." "Where are your facts?" asked Chinston, smiling. "My facts are all visible ones," said Felix, gravely pointing to the company. "They're all crooked on some point or another." There was a chorus of indignant denial at this, and then every one burst out laughing at the extraordinary way in which Mr. Rolleston was arguing. "If you go on like that in the House," said Frettlby, amused, "you will at all events have an entertaining Parliament." "Ah, they'll never have an entertaining Parliament till they admit ladies," observed Peterson, with a quizzical glance at Julia. "It will be a Parliament of love then," retorted the doctor dryly, "and not mediaeval either." Frettlby took the doctor's arm, and walked away with him. "I want you to come to my study, doctor," as they strolled towards the house, "and examine me." "Why, you don't feel well?" said Chinston, as they entered the house. "Not lately," replied Frettlby. "I'm afraid I've got heart disease." The doctor looked sharply at him, and then shook his head. "Nonsense," he said cheerfully. "It's a common delusion with people that they have heart disease, and in 9 cases out of 10 it's all imagination, unless, indeed," he added waggishly, "the patient happens to be a young man." "Ah! I suppose you think I'm safe as far as that goes," said Frettlby, as they entered the study. "And what did you think of Rolliston's argument about people being mad?" "It was amusing," replied Chinston, taking a seat, Frettlby doing the same. "That's all I can say about it, though, mind you, I think there are more mad people at large than the world is aware of." "Indeed!" "Yes. Do you remember that horrible story of Dickens, in the Pickwick Papers, about the man who was mad and knew it, yet successfully concealed it for years? Well, I believe there are many people like that in the world, people whose lives are one long struggle against insanity, and yet who eat, drink, talk, and walk with the rest of their fellow men, apparently as gay and light-hearted as they are." "How extraordinary!" "Half the murders and suicides are done in temporary fits of insanity," went on Chinston, "and if a person broods over anything, his incipient madness is sure to break out sooner or later; but, of course, there are cases where a perfectly sane person may commit a murder on the impulse of the moment, but I regard such persons as mad for the time being; but again a murder may be planned and executed in the most cold-blooded manner." "And in the latter case," said Frettlby, without looking at the doctor, and playing with a paper knife, "do you regard the murderer as mad?" "Yes, I do," answered the doctor bluntly. "He is mad as a person who kills another because he supposes he has been told by God to do so, only there is method in his madness. For instance, I believe that Hansom Cab murder in which you were mixed up—" "I wasn't mixed up in it," interrupted Frettlby, pale with anger. "Beg pardon," said Chinston coolly, "a slip of the tongue. I was thinking of Fitzgerald. Well, I believe that crime to have been premeditated, and that the man who committed it was mad. He is, no doubt, at large now, walking about and conducting himself as sanely as you or I, yet the germ of insanity is there, and sooner or later he will commit another crime." "How do you know it was premeditated?" asked Frettlby abruptly. "Anyone can see that," answered the other. "White was watched on that night, and when Fitzgerald went away the other was ready to take his place, dressed the same." "That's nothing," retorted Frettlby, looking at his companion sharply. "There are dozens of men in Melbourne who wear evening dress, light coats, and soft hats. In fact, I generally wear them myself." "Well, that might have been a coincidence," said the doctor, rather disconcerted, "but the use of chloroform puts the question beyond a doubt. People don't usually carry chloroform about with them." "I suppose not," answered the other, and then the matter dropped. Chinston made an examination of Mark Frettlby, and when he had finished, his face was very grave, though he laughed at the millionaire's fears. "You're all right," he said gaily. "Action of the heart a little weak, that's all. Only," impressively, "avoid excitement, avoid excitement." Just as Frettlby was putting on his coat, a knock came to the door, and Madge entered. "Brian is gone," she began. "Oh, I beg your pardon, doctor. But is papa ill?" she asked with sudden fear. "No, child, no," said Frettlby hastily. "I'm all right. I thought my heart was affected, but it isn't." "Not a bit of it," answered Chinston reassuringly. "All right, only avoid excitement." But when Frettlby turned to go to the door, Madge, who had her eyes fixed on the doctor's face, saw how grave it was. "There is danger," she said, touching his arm as they paused for a moment at the door. "No, no," he answered hastily. "Yes, there is," she persisted. "Tell me the worst. It is best for me to know." The doctor looked at her in some doubt for a few moments, and then placed his hand on her shoulder. "My dear young lady," he said gravely, "I will tell you what I have not dared to tell your father." "What?" she asked in a low voice, her face growing pale. "His heart is affected." "And there is great danger?" "Yes, great danger. In the event of any sudden shock," he hesitated. "Yes?" "He would probably drop down dead." "My God!" End of Chapter 25. Read by Sabella Denton. For more free audiobooks or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 26 of Mystery of a Hansom Cab by Fergus Hume. Read for LibriVox.org into the public domain. Kilsip has a theory of his own. Mr. Calton sat in his office reading a letter he had just received from Fitzgerald, and judging from the complacent smile upon his face, it seemed to give him the greatest satisfaction. "I know," wrote Brian, "that now you have taken up the affair you will not stop till you find out everything, so as I want the matter to rest as at present, I will anticipate you and reveal all. You were right in your conjecture that I knew something likely to lead to the detection of White's murderer, but when I tell you my reasons for keeping such a thing secret, I am sure you will not blame me. Mind you, I do not say that I know who committed the murder, but I have suspicions, very strong suspicions, and I wish to God Rosanna Moore had died before she told me what she did. However, I will tell you all, and leave you to judge as to whether I was justified in concealing what I was told. I will call at your office some time next week, and then you will learn everything that Rosanna Moore told me, but once you are possessed of the knowledge you will pity me." "Most extraordinary," mused Calton, leaning back in his chair as he laid down the letter. "I wonder if he's about to tell me that he killed White after all, and that Sal Rawlins perjured herself to save him. No, that's nonsense, or she'd have turned up in better time, and wouldn't have risked his neck up to the last moment. Though I make it a rule never to be surprised at anything, I expect what Brian Fitzgerald has to tell me will startle me considerably. I've never met with such an extraordinary case, and from all appearances the end isn't reached yet. After all," said Mr. Calton thoughtfully, "truth is stranger than fiction." Here a knock came to the door, and in answer to an invitation to enter, it opened, and Kilsip glided into the room. "You are not engaged, sir?" he said in his soft, low voice. "Oh dear no," answered Calton carelessly. "Come in, come in." Kilsip closed the door softly, and glided along in his usual velvet-footed manner, sat down in a chair near Calton's, and placing his hat on the ground, looked keenly at the barrister. "Well, Kilsip," said Calton, with a yawn, playing with his watch-chain, "any good news to tell me?" "Well, nothing particularly new," purred the detective, rubbing his hands together. "Nothing new, and nothing true, and no matter," said Calton, quoting Emerson. "And what have you come to see me about?" "The Hansom Cab murder," replied the other, quietly. "The deuce!" cried Calton, startled out of his professional dignity. "And have you found out who did it?" "No," answered Kilsip, rather dismally, "but I have an idea." "So had Gorby," retorted Calton, dryly. "An idea that ended in smoke. Have you any practical proofs?" "Not yet." "That means you are going to get some?" "If possible." "Much virtue in 'if,'" quoted Calton, picking up a pencil and scribbling idly on his blotting paper. "And to whom does your suspicion point?" "Aha!" said Mr. Kilsip, cautiously. "Don't know him," answered the other, coolly. "Family name Humbug, I presume." "Bosh! Whom do you suspect?" Kilsip looked round cautiously, as if to make sure they were alone, and then said in a stage whisper, "Roger Moreland." "That was the young man that gave evidence as to how White got drunk?" Kilsip nodded. "Well, and how do you connect him with the murder?" "Do you remember in the evidence given by the cabmen, Royston and Rankin, they both swore that the man who was with White on that night wore a diamond ring on the forefinger of the right hand? What of it? Nearly every second man in Melbourne wears a diamond ring. But not on the forefinger of the right hand. Oh! And Moreland wears a ring in that way?" "Yes." "Merely a coincidence. Is that all your proof?" "All I can obtain at present." "It's very weak," said Calton, scornfully. "The weakest proofs may form a chain to hang a man," observed Kilsip, sententiously. "Moreland gave his evidence clearly enough," said Calton, rising and pacing out of the room. "He met White, they got drunk together, White went out of the hotel, and shortly afterwards Moreland followed with the coat, which was left behind by White, and then someone snatched it from him." "Ah, did they?" interrupted Kilsip, quickly. "So Moreland says," said Calton, stopping short. "I understand. You think Moreland was not so drunk as he would make out, and that after following White outside, he put on his coat and got into the cab with him." "That is my theory." "It's ingenious enough," said the barrister, "but why should Moreland murder White? What motive had he?" "Those papers—" "Pshaw! Another idea of Gorby's," said Calton, angrily. "How do you know there were any papers?" The fact is, Calton did not intend Kilsip to know that White really had papers until he heard what Fitzgerald had to tell him. "And another thing," said Calton, resuming his walk. "If your theory is correct, which I don't think it is, what became of White's coat? Has Moreland got it?" "No, he has not," answered the detective, decisively. "You seem very positive about it," said the lawyer, after a moment's pause. "Did you ask Moreland about it?" A reproachful look came into Kilsip's white face. "Not quite so green," he said, forcing a smile. "I thought you'd a better opinion of me than that, Mr. Calton. Ask him? No." "Then how did you find out?" "The fact is, Moreland is employed as a barman in the Kangaroo Hotel." "A barman!" echoed Calton. "And he came out here as a gentleman of independent fortune. Why, hang it, man, that in itself is sufficient to prove that he had no motive to murder White. Moreland pretty well lived on White, so what could have induced him to kill his golden goose and become a barman? Pshaw, the idea is absurd." "Well, you may be right about the matter," said Kilsip, rather angrily, "and if Gorby makes mistakes I don't pretend to be infallible. But at all events, when I saw Moreland in the bar he wore a silver ring on the forefinger of his right hand." "Silver isn't a diamond." "No, but it shows that was the finger he was accustomed to wear his ring on. When I saw that I determined to search his room. I managed to do so while he was out, and found—" "A mare's nest?" Kilsip nodded. "And so your castle of cards falls to the ground," said Calton, jestingly. "Your idea's absurd. Moreland no more committed the murder than I did. Why, he was too drunk on that night to do anything." "Humph! So he says. Well, men don't calumniate themselves for nothing. It was a lesser danger to avoid a greater one," replied Kilsip, coolly. "I am sure that Moreland was not drunk on that night. He only said so to escape awkward questions as to his movements. Depend upon it, he knows more than he lets out." "Well, and how do you intend to set about the matter?" "I shall start looking for the coat first." "Ah! You think he has hidden it?" "I am pretty sure of it. My theory is this. When Moreland got out of the cab at Powlett Street—" "But he didn't," interrupted Calton, angrily. "Let us suppose, for the sake of argument, that he did," said Kilsip, quietly. "I say, when he left the cab he walked up Powlett Street, turned to the left down George Street, and walked back to town through the Fitzroy Gardens. Then, knowing that the coat was noticeable, he threw it away, or rather hid it, and walked out of the Gardens through the town. In evening dress, more noticeable than the coat." "He wasn't in evening dress," said Kilsip, quietly. "No, neither was he," observed Calton, eagerly, recalling the evidence at the trial. "Another blow to your theory. The murderer was in evening dress. The cabman said so." "Yes, because he had seen Mr. Fitzgerald in evening dress a few minutes before, and thought that he was the same man who got into the cab with White." "Well, what of that?" "If you remember, the second man had his coat buttoned up. Moreland wore dark trousers, at least I suppose so, and with the coat buttoned up, it was easy for the cabman to make the mistake, believing, as he did, that it was Mr. Fitzgerald." "That sounds better," said Calton, thoughtfully. "And what are you going to do?" "Look for the coat in the Fitzroy Gardens." "Pshaw! A wild goose chase." "Possibly," said Kilsip, as he arose to go. "And when shall I see you again?" said Calton. "Oh, to-night," said Kilsip, pausing at the door. "I had nearly forgotten. Mother Guttersnipe wants to see you." "Why? What's up?" "She's dying, and wants to tell you some secret." "Rosanna Moore, by Jove!" said Calton. "She'll tell me something about her. I'll get to the bottom of this yet. All right, I'll be here at 8 o'clock." "Very well, sir," and the detective glided out. "I wonder if that old woman knows anything," said Calton to himself, as he resumed his seat. "She may have overheard some conversation between White and his mistress, and intends to divulge it. Well, I'm afraid when Fitzgerald does confess, I shall know all about it beforehand." End of Chapter 26. Read by Sabella Denton. For more free audiobooks, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 27 of Mystery of a Hansom Cab by Fergus Hume. Read for LibriVox.org into the public domain. Mother Guttersnipe joins the majority. Punctual to his appointment, Kilsip called at Calton's office at 8 o'clock, in order to guide him through the squalid labyrinths of the slums. He found the barrister waiting impatiently for him. The fact is, Calton had got it into his head that Rosanna Moore was at the bottom of the whole mystery, and every new piece of evidence he discovered went to confirm his belief. When Rosanna Moore was dying, she might have confessed something to Mother Guttersnipe, which would hint at the name of the murderer, and he had a strong suspicion that the old hag had received hush money in order to keep quiet. Several times before Calton had been on the point of going to her and trying to get the secret out of her, that is, if she knew it, but now fate appeared to be playing into his hands, and a voluntary confession was much more likely to be true than one dragged piecemeal from unwilling lips. By the time Kilsip made his appearance Calton was in a high state of excitement. "I suppose we'd better go at once," he said to Kilsip as he lit a cigar. "That old hag may go off at any moment." "She might," assented Kilsip, doubtfully, "but I wouldn't be a bit surprised if she pulled through. Some of these old women have 9 lives like a cat." "Not improbable," retorted Calton as they passed into the brilliantly lighted street. "Her nature seemed to me to be essentially feline. But tell me," he went on, "what's the matter with her? Old age?" "Partly. Drink also, I think," answered Kilsip. "Besides, her surroundings are not very healthy, and her dissipated habits have pretty well settled her." "It isn't anything catching, I hope?" cried the barrister, with a shudder, as they passed into the crowd of Bourke Street. "Don't know, sir, not being a doctor," answered the detective, stolidly. "Oh!" ejaculated Calton, in dismay. "It will be all right, sir," said Kilsip, reassuringly. "I've been there dozens of times, and I'm all right." "I daresay," retorted the barrister, "but I may go there once and catch it, whatever it is." "Take my word, sir, it's nothing worse than old age and drink." "Has she a doctor?" "Won't let one come near her. Prescribes for herself." "Gin, I suppose. Humph! Much more unpleasant than the usual run of medicines." In a short time they found themselves in Little Bourke Street, and after traversing a few dark and narrow lanes, by this time they were more or less familiar to Calton, they found themselves before Mother Guttersnipe's den. They climbed the rickety stairs, which groaned and creaked beneath their weight, and found Mother Guttersnipe lying on the bed in the corner. The elfish, black-haired child was playing cards with a slatternly-looking girl at a deal table by the faint light of a tallow candle. They both sprang to their feet as the strangers entered, and the elfish child pushed a broken chair in a sullen manner towards Mr. Calton, while the other girl shuffled into a far corner of the room, and crouched down there like a dog. The noise of their entry awoke the hag from an uneasy slumber into which she had fallen. Sitting up in bed, she huddled the clothes round her. She presented such a gruesome spectacle that involuntarily Calton recoiled. Her white hair was unbound, and hung in tangled masses over her shoulders in snowy profusion. Her face, parched and wrinkled, with the hooked nose and beady black eyes, like those of a mouse, was poked forward, and her skinny arms, bare to the shoulder, were waving wildly about as she grasped at the bedclothes with her claw-like hands. The square bottle and the broken cup lay beside her, and filling herself a dram, she lapped it up greedily. The irritant brought on a paroxysm of coughing, which lasted until the elfish child shook her well, and took the cup from her. "Greedy old beast," muttered this amiable infant, peering into the cup. "You'd drink the yarrer dry, I believe." "Yah!" muttered the old woman feebly. "Who's they, Lizer?" she said, shading her eyes with one trembling hand, while she looked at Calton and the detective. "The perlice cove in the swell," said Lizer suddenly. "Come to see yer turn up your toes." "I ain't dead yet, you whelp," snarled the hag with sudden energy, "and if I gets up I'll turn up your toes, cuss ye." Lizer gave a shrill laugh of disdain, and Kilsip stepped forward. "None of this," he said sharply, taking Lizer by one thin shoulder, and pushing her over to where the other girl was crouching. "Stop there till I tell you to move." Lizer tossed back her tangled black hair, and was about to make some impudent reply, when the other girl, who was older and wiser, put out her hand and pulled her down beside her. Meanwhile, Calton was addressing himself to the old woman in the corner. "You wanted to see me?" he said gently, for, notwithstanding his repugnance to her, she was, after all, a woman, and dying. "Yes, cuss ye," croaked Mother Guttersnipe, lying down, and pulling the greasy bedclothes up to her neck. "You ain't a parson?" with sudden suspicion. "No, I'm a lawyer." "I ain't a-going to have the cussed parsons a-prowling around here," growled the old woman viciously. "I ain't a-going to die yet, cuss ye. I'm going to get well and strong, and have a good time of it." "I'm afraid you won't recover," said Calton gently. "You had better let me send for a doctor." "No, I shan't," retorted the hag, aiming a blow at him with all her feeble strength. "I ain't a-going to have my insides spoiled with salts and senner. I don't want neither parsons nor doctors, I don't. I wouldn't have a lawyer, only I'm a-thinking of making my will, I am." "Mind I gets the watch," yelled Lizer from the corner. "If she gives it to Sal I'll tear her eyes out." "Silence!" said Kilsip, sharply, and with a muttered curse Lizer sat back in her corner. "Sharper than a serpent's tooth, she are," whined the old woman, when quiet was once more restored. "That young devil'd have fed my home, and now she turns, cuss her." "Well, well," said Calton rather impatiently, "what is it you wanted to see me about?" "Don't be in such a hurry," said the hag with a scowl, "or I'm blamed if I'll tell you anything, s'help me." She was evidently growing very weak, so Calton turned to Kilsip and told him in a whisper to get a doctor. The detective scribbled a note on some paper, and giving it to Lizer, ordered her to take it. At this the other girl arose, and putting her arm in that of the child's, they left together. "Them two young 'ussies gone?" said Mother Guttersnipe. "Right you are, for I don't want what I've got to tell to get into the newspaper, I don't." "And what is it?" asked Calton, bending forward. The old woman took another drink of gin, and it seemed to put life into her, for she sat up in the bed, and commenced to talk rapidly, as though she were afraid of dying before her secret was told. "You've been here afore," she said, pointing one skinny finger at Calton, "and you wanted to find out all about her, but you didn't. She wouldn't let me tell, for she was always a proud jade, a flouncin' round while her poor mother was a starvin'." "Her mother! Are you Rosanna Moore's mother?" cried Calton, considerably astonished. "May I die if I ain't," croaked the hag. "Her poor father died of drink, cuss him, and I'm a follerin' him to the same place in the same way. You weren't about town in the old days, or you'd have been after her, cuss you." "After Rosanna? The very girl," answered Mother Guttersnipe. "She were on the stage, she were, and my eye, what a swell she were, with all the coves a-dyin' for her, and she dancin' over their black arts, cuss 'em. But she was allays good to me till 'e came." "Who came?" "'E!" yelled the old woman, raising herself on her arm, her eyes sparkling with vindictive fury. "'E, a-comin' round with diamonds and gold, and a-ruinin' my poor girl, and now 'e's held his bloomin' head up all these years as if he were a saint, cuss him, cuss him." "Whom does she mean?" whispered Calton to Kilsip. "Mean!" screamed Mother Guttersnipe, whose sharp ears had caught the muttered question. "Why, Mark Frettlby!" "Good God!" Calton rose up in his astonishment, and even Kilsip's inscrutable countenance displayed some surprise. "Ay, 'e were a swell in them days," pursued Mother Guttersnipe, "and 'e comes a philanderin' round my gal, cuss him, and ruins her, and leaves her and the child to starve, like a black-hearted villain as he were." "The child? Her name?" "Bah!" retorted the hag with scorn, "as if you didn't know my granddaughter Sal." "Sal, Mark Frettlby's child?" "Yes, and as pretty a girl as the other, though she 'appened to be born on the wrong side of the edge. Oh, I've seen her a-sweepin' along in her silks and satins as though we were dirt, and Sal her half-sister, cuss her." Exhausted by the efforts she had made, the old woman sank back in her bed, while Calton sat dazed, thinking over the astounding revelation that had just been made. That Rosanna Moore should turn out to be Mark Frettlby's mistress he had hardly wondered at. After all, the millionaire was but a man, and in his young days had been no better and no worse than the rest of his friends. Rosanna Moore was pretty, and was evidently one of those women who, rakes at heart, prefer the untrammelled freedom of being a mistress to the sedate bondage of a wife. In questions of morality, so many people live in glass houses that there are few nowadays who can afford to throw stones. Calton did not think any the worse of Frettlby for his youthful follies. But what did surprise him was that Frettlby should be so heartless as to leave his child to the tender mercies of an old hag like Mother Guttersnipe. It was so entirely different from what he knew of the man, that he was inclined to think that the old woman was playing him a trick. "Did Mark Frettlby know that Sal was his child?" he asked. "Not 'e," snarled Mother Guttersnipe, in an exultant tone. "'E thought she was dead, 'e did, after Rosanna gave him the go-by." "And why did you not tell him?" "'Cause I wanted to break his heart if he 'ad any," said the old beldame vindictively. "Sal was a-goin' wrong as fast as she could till she was took from me. If she had gone and got into quod I'd have gone to him and said, 'Look at your daughter! 'Ow I've ruined her as you did mine!'" "You wicked woman!" said Calton, revolted at the malignity of the scheme. "You sacrificed an innocent girl for this." "None of your preachin'," retorted the hag sullenly. "I ain't been brought up for a saint, I ain't, and I wanted to pay him out. He paid me well to my old tongue about my daughter, and I got it 'ere," laying her hand on the pillow, "all gold, good gold, and mine, cuss me." Calton rose. He felt quite sick at this exhibition of human depravity, and longed to be away. As he was putting on his hat, however, the two girls entered with the doctor, who nodded to Kilsip, cast a sharp, scrutinizing glance at Calton, and then walked over to the bed. The two girls went back to their corner, and waited in silence for the end. Mother Guttersnipe had fallen back in the bed, with one claw-like hand clutching the pillow, as if to protect her beloved gold, and over her face a deathly paleness was spreading, which told the practised eye of the doctor that the end was near. He knelt down beside the bed for a moment, holding the candle to the dying woman's face. She opened her eyes and muttered drowsily, "Who's you? Get out!" But then she seemed to grasp the situation again, and she started up with a shrill yell, which made the hearers shudder, it was so weird and eerie. "My money!" she yelled, clasping the pillow in her skinny arms. "It's all mine! You shan't have it, cuss ye!" The doctor arose from his knees and shrugged his shoulders. "Not worth while doing anything," he said coolly. "She'll be dead soon." The old woman, mumbling over her pillow, caught the word, and burst into tears. "Dead, dead! My poor Rosanna, with her golden hair, always loving her poor mother till he took her away, and she came back to die, oh!" Her voice died away in a long, melancholy wail, that made the two girls in the corner shiver, and put their fingers in their ears. "My good woman," said the doctor, bending over the bed, "would you not like to see a minister?" She looked at him with her bright, beady eyes, already somewhat dimmed with the mists of death, and said, in a harsh, low whisper, "Why?" "Because you have only a short time to live," said the doctor gently. "You are dying." Mother Guttersnipe sprang up, and seized his arm with a scream of terror. "Dying! Dying! No! No!" she wailed, clawing his sleeve. "I ain't fit to die. Cuss me! Save me! Save me! I don't know where I'd go to, s'help me! Save me!" The doctor tried to remove her hands, but she held on with wonderful tenacity. "It is impossible," he said briefly. The hag fell back in her bed. "I'll give you money to save me," she shrieked. "Good money. All mine, all mine. See here, sovereigns," and tearing her pillow open, she took out a canvas bag, and from it poured a gleaming stream of gold. Gold, gold, it rolled all over the bed, over the floor, away into the dark corners, yet no one touched it, so enchanted were they by the horrible spectacle of the dying woman clinging to life. She clutched some of the shining pieces, and held them up to the three men as they stood silently beside the bed, but her hands trembled so that sovereigns kept falling from them on the floor with metallic clinks. "All mine, all mine!" she shrieked loudly. "Give me my life! Gold! Money! Cuss ye! I sold my soul for it! Save me! Give me my life!" And with trembling hands she tried to force the gold on them. They said no word, but stood silently looking at her, while the two girls in the corner clung together and trembled with fear. "Don't look at me! Don't!" cried the hag, falling down again amid the shining gold. "You want me to die! I shan't! I shan't! Give me my gold!" clawing at the scattered sovereigns. "I'll take it with me! I shan't die! God! God!" whimpering. "I ain't done nothin'! Let me live! Give me a Bible! Save me! God cuss it! God! God!" She fell back on the bed, a corpse. The faint light of the candle flickered on the shining gold, and on the dead face, framed in tangled white hair, while the three men, sick at heart, turned away in silence to seek assistance, with that wild cry still ringing in their ears. "God save me! God!" End of chapter 27. Read by Sabella Denton. For more free audiobooks or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 28 of Mystery of a Hansom Cab by Fergus Hume. Read for LibriVox.org into the public domain. Mark Frettleby has a visitor. According to the copybooks of our youth, procrastination is the thief of time. Now, Brian found the truth of this. He had been in town almost a week, but he had not yet been to see Calton. Each morning, or something very near it, he set out, determined to go direct to Chancery Lane, but he never arrived there. He had returned to his lodgings in East Melbourne, and had passed his time either in the house or in the garden. When perhaps business connected with the sale of his station compelled his presence in town, he drove straight there and back. Curiously enough, he shrank from meeting any of his friends. He felt keenly his recent position in the prisoner's dock, and even when walking by the Yarra, as he frequently did, he was conscious of an uneasy feeling, a feeling that he was an object of curiosity, and that people turned to look at him out of a morbid desire to see one who had been so nearly hanged for murder. As soon as his station should be sold and he married to Madge, he determined to leave Australia and never set foot on it again. But until he could leave the place he would see no one, nor would he mix with his former friends, so great was his dread of being stared at. Mrs. Sampson, who had welcomed him back with shrill exclamations of delight, was loud in her expressions of disapproval as to the way he was shutting himself up. "Your eyes bein' hollow," said the sympathizing Cricket, "it is nat'ral, it's its want of air, which my husband's uncle, being a druggist, and well-to-do, in Collingwood, sees thou a want of oxygen, being a French name, as he called the atmosphere, were fearful for pulling people down, and making 'em go off their food, which you hardly eats anything, and not being a butterfly it's expected as your appetite would be larger." "Oh, I'm all right," said Brian, absently lighting a cigarette, and only half listening to his landlady's garrulous chatter. "But if anyone calls, tell them I'm not in. I don't want to be bothered by visitors." "Bein' as wise a thing as Solomon ever said," answered Mrs. Sampson, energetically, "which no doubt he was in good health when seein' the Queen of Sheber, as necessary when any one calls, and not feelin' disposed to speak, which I'm often that way myself on occasions, my spirits being low, as I've heard soda water to have that effect on 'em, which you takes it with a dash of brandy, though to be sure that might be the cause of your want of life, and drat that bell," she finished, hurrying out of the room as the front door bell sounded, "which my legs is a giving way under me through being overworked." Meanwhile, Brian sat and smoked contentedly, much relieved by the departure of Mrs. Sampson, with her constant chatter, but he soon heard her mount the stairs again, and she entered the room with a telegram, which she handed to her lodger. "'Opin' it don't contain bad news," she said as she retreated to the door again, "which I don't like 'em havin' had a shock in early life, through one 'avin' come unexpected, as my uncle's grandfather were dead, 'avin' perished of consumption, our family all being disposed to the disease. And now, if you'll excuse me, sir, I'll get to my dinner, being in the 'abit of taking my meals reg'lar, and I studies my inside carefully, being easily upset, through which I never could be a sailor." Mrs. Sampson, having at last exhausted herself, went out of the room, and crackled loudly down the stairs, leaving Brian to read his telegram. He tore open the envelope and found the message was from Madge, to say that they had returned, and to ask him to dine with them that evening. Fitzgerald folded up the telegram, then, rising from his seat, he walked moodily up and down the room with his hands in his pockets. "So he is there," said the young man aloud, "and I shall have to meet him and shake hands with him, knowing all the time what he is. If it were not for Madge I'd leave this place at once, but after the way she stood by me in my trouble, I should be a coward if I did so." It was as Madge had predicted. Her father was unable to stay long in one place, and had come back to Melbourne a week after Brian had arrived. The pleasant party at the station was broken up, and, like the graves of a household, the guests were scattered far and wide. Peterson had left for New Zealand en route for the wonders of the hot lakes, and the old colonist was about to start for England in order to refresh his boyish memories. Mr. and Mrs. Rolleston had come back to Melbourne, where the wretched Felix was compelled once more to plunge into politics, and Dr. Chinston had resumed his usual routine of fees and patients. Madge was glad to be back in Melbourne again, as now that her health was restored she craved for the excitement of town life. It was now more than 3 months since the murder, and the 9 days' wonder was a thing of the past. The possibility of a war with Russia was the one absorbing topic of the hour, and the colonists were busy preparing for the attack of a possible enemy. As the Spanish kings had drawn their treasures from Mexico and Peru, so might the White Czar lay violent hands on the golden stores of Australia, but here there were no uncultured savages to face, but the sons and grandsons of men who had dimmed the glories of the Russian arms at Alma and Balaclava. So in the midst of stormy rumours of wars the tragic fate of Oliver White was quite forgotten. After the trial, everyone, including the detective office, had given up the matter, and mentally relegated it to the list of undiscovered crimes. In spite of the utmost vigilance, nothing new had been discovered, and it seemed likely that the assassin of Oliver White would remain a free man. There were only 2 people in Melbourne who still held the contrary opinion, and they were Calton and Kilsip. Both these men had sworn to discover this unknown murderer, who struck his cowardly blow in the dark, and, though there seemed no possible chance of success, yet they worked on. Kilsip suspected Roger Moreland, the boon companion of the dead man, but his suspicions were vague and uncertain, and there seemed little hope of verifying them. The barrister did not as yet suspect any particular person, though the deathbed confession of Mother Guttersnipe had thrown a new light on the subject, but he thought that when Fitzgerald told him the secret which Rosanna Moore had confided to his keeping, the real murderer would soon be discovered, or at least some clue would be found that would lead to his detection. So, as the matter stood at the time of Mark Frettlby's return to Melbourne, Mr. Calton was waiting for Fitzgerald's confession before making a move, while Kilsip worked stealthily in the dark, searching for evidence against Moreland. On receiving Madge's telegram, Brian determined to go down in the evening, but not to dinner, so he sent a reply to Madge to that effect. He did not want to meet Mark Frettlby, but did not, of course, tell this to Madge, so she had her dinner by herself, as her father had gone to his club, and the time of his return was uncertain. After dinner, she wrapped a light cloak round her, and repaired to the verandah to wait for her lover. The garden looked charming in the moonlight, with the black, dense cypress trees standing up against the sky, and the great fountain splashing cool and silvery. There was a heavily foliaged oak by the gate, and she strolled down the path, and stood under it in the shadow, listening to the whisper and rustle of its multitudinous leaves. It is curious the unearthly glamour which moonlight seems to throw over everything, and though Madge knew every flower, tree, and shrub in the garden, yet they all looked weird and fantastical in the cold white light. She went up to the fountain, and, seating herself on the edge, amused herself by dipping her hand into the chilly water, and letting it fall, like silver rain, back into the basin. Then she heard the iron gate open and shut with a clash, and, springing to her feet, saw someone coming up the path in a light coat and soft, wide-awake hat. "Oh, it's you at last, Brian!" she cried, as she ran down the path to meet him. "Why did you not come before?" "Not being Brian, I can't say," answered her father's voice. Madge burst out laughing. "What an absurd mistake!" she cried. "Why, I thought you were Brian." "Indeed!" "Yes, in that hat and coat I couldn't tell the difference in the moonlight." "Oh!" said her father with a laugh, pushing his hat back. "Moonlight is necessary to complete the spell, I suppose." "Of course," answered his daughter. "If there were no moonlight, alas for lovers!" "Alas, indeed!" echoed her father. "They would become as extinct as the moa. But where are your eyes, Puss, when you take an old man like me for your gay young Lochinvar?" "Well, really, papa," answered Madge deprecatingly, "you do look so like him in that coat and hat that I could not tell the difference till you spoke." "Nonsense, child," said Frettlby roughly. "You are fanciful." And turning on his heel, he walked rapidly towards the house, leaving Madge staring after him in astonishment, as well she might, for her father had never spoken to her so roughly before. Wondering at the cause of his sudden anger, she stood spellbound, until there came a step behind her and a soft low whistle. She turned with a scream, and saw Brian smiling at her. "Oh, it's you," she said with a pout, as he caught her in his arms and kissed her. "Only me," said Brian ungrammatically. "Disappointing, isn't it?" "Oh, fearfully," answered the girl with a gay laugh, as arm in arm they walked towards the house. "But do you know I made such a curious mistake just now? I thought papa was you." "How strange!" said Brian absently, for indeed he was admiring her charming face, which looked so pure and sweet in the moonlight. "Yes, wasn't it?" she replied. "He had on a light coat and a soft hat, just like you wear sometimes, and as you are both the same height, I took you for one another." Brian did not answer, but there was a cold feeling at his heart as he saw a possibility of his worst suspicions being confirmed, for just at that moment there came into his mind the curious coincidence of the man who got into the hansom cab being dressed similarly to himself. What if— "Nonsense," he said aloud, rousing himself out of the train of thought the resemblance had suggested. "I'm sure it isn't," said Madge, who had been talking about something else for the last 5 minutes. "You are a very rude young man." "I beg your pardon," said Brian, waking up. "You were saying—" "That the horse is the most noble of all animals. Exactly." "I don't understand—" began Brian, rather puzzled. "Of course you don't," interrupted Madge petulantly, "considering I've been wasting my eloquence on a deaf man for the last 10 minutes, and very likely lame as well as deaf." And to prove the truth of the remark, she ran up the path with Brian after her. He had a long chase of it, for Madge was nimble and better acquainted with the garden than he was, but at last he caught her just as she was running up the steps into the house, and then history repeats itself. They went into the drawing-room and found that Mr. Frettlby had gone up to his study, and did not want to be disturbed. Madge sat down to the piano, but before she struck a note, Brian took both her hands prisoners. "Madge," he said gravely, as she turned round, "what did your father say when you made that mistake?" "He was very angry," she answered, "quite cross. I'm sure I don't know why." Brian sighed as he released her hands, and was about to reply when the visitors' bell sounded. They heard the servants answer it, and then someone was taken upstairs to Mr. Frettlby's study. When the coachman came in to light the gas, Madge asked who it was that had come to the door. "I don't know, miss," he answered, "but he said he wanted to see Mr. Frettlby particularly, so I took him up to the study." "But I thought papa said he was not to be disturbed." "Yes, miss, but the gentleman had an appointment with him." "Poor papa!" sighed Madge, turning again to the piano. "He has always got such a lot to do." Left to themselves, Madge began playing Waldteufel's Last New Valse, a dreamy, haunting melody, with a touch of sadness in it, and Brian, lying lazily on the sofa, listened. Then she sang a gay little French song about love and a butterfly, with a mocking refrain, which made Brian laugh. "A memory of Offenbach," he said, rising and coming over to the piano. "We certainly can't reproach the French in writing these airy trifles." "They're unsatisfactory, I think," said Madge, running her fingers over the keys. "They mean nothing." "Of course not," he replied. "But don't you remember that De Quincey says there is no moral, either big or little, in the Iliad?" "Well, I think there's more music in Barbara Allen than all those frothy things," said Madge, with fine scorn. "Come and sing it." "A 5-act funeral it is," groaned Brian, as he rose to obey. "Let's have Garry Owen instead." Nothing else, however, would suit the capricious young person at the piano, so Brian, who had a pleasant voice, sang the quaint old ditty of cruel Barbara Allen, who treated her dying love with such disdain. "Sir John Graham was an ass," said Brian, when he had finished, "or instead of dying in such a silly manner, he'd have married her right off, without asking her permission." "I don't think she was worth marrying," replied Madge, opening a book of Mendelssohn's duets, "or she wouldn't have made such a fuss over her health not being drunk." "Depend upon it, she was a plain woman," remarked Brian gravely, "and was angry because she wasn't toasted among the rest of the country belles. I think the young man had a narrow escape. She'd always have reminded him about that unfortunate oversight." "You seem to have analysed her nature pretty well," said Madge, a little dryly. "However, we'll leave the failings of Barbara Allen alone, and sing this." This was Mendelssohn's charming duet, "Would that my love," which was a great favourite of Brian's. They were in the middle of it, when suddenly Madge stopped, as she heard a loud cry, evidently proceeding from her father's study. Recollecting Dr. Chinston's warning, she ran out of the room, and upstairs, leaving Brian rather puzzled by her unceremonious departure, for though he had heard the cry, yet he did not attach much importance to it. Madge knocked at the study door, and then she tried to open it, but it was locked. "Who's there?" asked her father sharply from inside. "Only me, papa," she answered. "I thought you were—" "No, no, I'm all right," replied her father quickly. "Go downstairs. I'll join you shortly." Madge went back to the drawing-room only half satisfied with the explanation. She found Brian waiting at the door, with rather an anxious face. "What's the matter?" he asked, as she paused a moment at the foot of the stairs. "Papa says nothing," she replied, "but I am sure he must have been startled, or he would not have cried out like that." She told him what Dr. Chinston had said about the state of her father's heart, a recital which shocked Brian greatly. They did not return to the drawing-room, but went out on the verandah, where, after wrapping a cloak around Madge, Fitzgerald lit a cigarette. They sat down at the far end of the verandah, somewhat in the shadow, and could see the hall door wide open, and a warm flood of mellow light pouring therefrom, and beyond the cold, white moonshine. After about a quarter of an hour, Madge's alarm about her father having somewhat subsided, they were chatting on indifferent subjects, when a man came out of the hall door, and paused for a moment on the steps of the verandah. He was dressed in rather a fashionable suit of clothes, but in spite of the heat of the night, he had a thick white silk scarf round his throat. "That's rather a cool individual," said Brian, removing his cigarette from between his lips. "I wonder what— Good God!" he cried, rising to his feet as the stranger turned round to look at the house, and took off his hat for a moment. "Roger Moreland!" The man started, and looked quickly round into the dark shadow of the verandah where they were seated; then, putting on his hat, he ran quickly down the path, and they heard the gate clang after him. Madge felt a sudden fear at the expression on Brian's face, as revealed by a ray of moonlight streaming full on it. "Who is Roger Moreland?" she asked, touching his arm. "Ah, I remember," with sudden horror. "Oliver Whyte's friend." "Yes," in a hoarse whisper, "and one of the witnesses at the trial." End of Chapter 28. Read by Sabella Denton. For more free audiobooks or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 29 of Mystery of a Hansom Cab by Fergus Hume. Read for LibriVox.org into the public domain. Mr. Calton's curiosity is satisfied. There was not much sleep for Brian that night. He left Madge almost immediately, and went home, but he did not go to bed. He felt too anxious and ill at ease to sleep, and passed the greater part of the night walking up and down his room, occupied with his own sad thoughts. He was wondering in his own mind what could be the meaning of Roger Moreland's visit to Mark Frettlby. All the evidence that he had given at the trial was that he had met Whyte, and had been drinking with him during the evening. Whyte then went out, and that was the last Moreland had seen of him. Now the question was, what did he go to see Mark Frettlby for? He had no acquaintance with him, and yet called by appointment. It is true that he might have been in poverty, and the millionaire being well known as an extremely generous man, Moreland might have called on him for money. But then the cry which Frettlby had given after the interview had lasted a short time proved that he had been startled. Madge had gone upstairs and found the door locked, her father refusing her admission. Now why was he so anxious Moreland should not be seen by anyone? That he had made some startling revelation was certain, and Fitzgerald felt sure that it was in connection with the Hansom Cab murder case. He wearied himself with conjectures about the matter, and towards daybreak threw himself, dressed as he was, on the bed, and slept heavily till 12 o'clock the next day. When he arose and looked at himself in the glass, he was startled at the haggard and worn appearance of his face. The moment he was awake his mind went back to Mark Frettlby and the visit of Roger Moreland. "The net is closing round him," he murmured to himself. "I don't see how he can escape. Oh, Madge, Madge, if only I could spare you the bitterness of knowing what you must know sooner or later, and that other unhappy girl. The sins of the fathers will be visited on the children. God help them!" He took his bath, and after dressing himself went into his sitting room, where he had a cup of tea, which refreshed him considerably. Mrs. Sampson came crackling merrily upstairs with a letter, and gave vent to an exclamation of surprise, on seeing his altered appearance. "Lor, sir!" she exclaimed, "what have you been a-doing? Me knowing your 'abits as you'd gone to bed, not to say as it's very tempting in this hot weather, but with excuses, sir, you looks as if you hadn't slept a blessed wink." "No more have I," said Brian, listlessly holding out his hand for the letter. "I was walking up and down my room all last night. I must have walked miles." "Ah, how that puts me in mind of my poor husband," chirped the cricket. "Bein' a printer, and accustomed like a howl to the darkness, when he was 'ome for the night he walked up and down till he wore out the carpet, bein' an expensive one, as I 'ad on my marriage, and the only way I could stop him was by giving him something soothin', which you, sir, ought to try. Whisky, hot, with lemon and sugar, and I've heard tell as chloroform—" "No, damn it," said Brian hastily, startled out of his politeness. "I've had enough of that." "Achin' teeth, no doubt," said the landlady, going to the door, "which I'm often taken that way myself, decayed teeth runnin' in the family, though to be sure mine are stronger than former, a lodger of mine havin' been a dentist, and doin' them beautiful, instead of payin' rent, not havin' ready cash, his boxes being filled with bricks on his departure from the house." As Brian did not appear particularly interested in these domestic reminiscences, and seemed as if he wanted to be left alone, Mrs. Sampson, with a final crackle, went downstairs and talked with a neighbour in the kitchen, as to the desirability of drawing her money out of the savings bank, in case the Russians should surprise and capture Melbourne. Brian, left alone, stared out of the window at the dusty road and the black shadows cast by the tall poplars in front of the house. "I must leave this place," he said to himself. "Every chance remark seems to bear on the murder, and I'm not anxious to have it constantly by my side, like a skeleton at the feast." Suddenly he recollected the letter which he held in his hand, and which he now looked at for the first time. It proved to be from Madge, and tearing it open hastily, he read: "I cannot understand what is the matter with papa," she wrote. "Ever since that man Moreland left last night, he has shut himself up in his study, and is writing there hour after hour. I went up this morning, but he would not let me in. He did not come down to breakfast, and I am getting seriously alarmed. Come down to-morrow and see me, for I am anxious about his state of health, and I am sure that Moreland told him something which has upset him." "Writing," said Brian, as he put the letter in his pocket. "What about, I wonder? Perhaps he is thinking of committing suicide! If so, I for one will not stop him. It is a horrible thing to do, but it would be acting for the best under the circumstances." In spite of his determination to see Calton and tell all, Fitzgerald did not go near him that day. He felt ill and weary, the want of sleep and mental worry telling on him terribly, and he looked 10 years older than he did before the murder of White. It is trouble which draws lines on the smooth forehead and furrows round the mouth. If a man has any mental worry, his life becomes a positive agony to him. Mental tortures are quite as bad as physical ones, if not worse. The last thing before dropping off to sleep is the thought of trouble, and with the first faint light of dawn, it returns and hammers all day at the weary brain. But while a man can sleep, life is rendered at least endurable, and of all the blessings which Providence has bestowed, there is none so precious as that same sleep, which, as wise Sancho Panza says, wraps every man like a cloak. Brian felt the need of rest, so sending a telegram to Calton to call on him in the morning, and another to Madge that he would be down to luncheon next day, he stayed indoors all day, and amused himself with smoking and reading. He went to bed early, and succeeded in having a sound sleep, so when he awoke next morning he felt considerably refreshed and invigorated. He was having his breakfast at 8:30, when he heard the sound of wheels, and immediately afterwards a ring at the bell. He went to the window, and saw Calton's trap was at the door. The owner was shortly afterwards shown into the room. "Well, you are a nice fellow," cried Calton, after greetings were over. "Here I've been waiting for you with all the patience of Job, thinking you were still up country." "Will you have some breakfast?" asked Brian, laughing at his indignation. "What have you got?" said Calton, looking over the table. "Ham and eggs. Your landlady's culinary ideas are very limited." "Most landladies' ideas are," retorted Fitzgerald, resuming his breakfast. "Unless Heaven invents some new animal, lodgers will go on getting beef and mutton, alternated with hash, until the end of the world." "When one is in Rome, one mustn't speak ill of the Pope," answered Calton, with a grimace. "Do you think your landlady could supply me with brandy and soda?" "I think so," answered Fitzgerald, rising and ringing the bell. "But isn't it rather early for that sort of thing?" "There's a proverb about glass houses," said Calton severely, "which applies to you in this particular instance." Whereupon Fitzgerald laughed, and Calton, having been supplied with what he required, prepared to talk business. "I need hardly tell you how anxious I am to hear what you've got to say," he said, leaning back in his chair. "But I may as well tell you that I am satisfied that I know half of your secret already." "Indeed!" Fitzgerald looked astonished. "In that case I need not—" "Yes, you need," retorted Calton. "I told you I only know half." "Which half?" "Rather difficult to answer. However, I'll tell you what I know, and you can supply all deficiencies. I am quite ready— Go on. Stop." He arose and closed the door carefully. "Well," resuming his seat, "Mother Guttersnipe died the other night." "Is she dead?" "As a door nail," answered Calton calmly, "and a horrible deathbed it was. Her screams ring in my ears yet. But before she died she sent for me and said—" "What?" "That she was the mother of Rosanna Moore." "Yes?" "And that Sal Rawlins was Rosanna's child." "And the father," said Brian in a low voice, "was Mark Frettlby." "Ah!" "And now what have you to tell me?" "Nothing!" "Nothing!" echoed Calton, surprised. "Then this is what Rosanna Moore told you when she died?" "Yes." "Then why have you made such a mystery about it?" "You ask that?" said Fitzgerald, looking up in surprise. "If I had told it, don't you see what a difference it would have made to Madge?" "I'm sure I don't," retorted the barrister, completely mystified. "I suppose you mean Frettlby's connection with Rosanna Moore. Well, of course it was not a very creditable thing for her to have been Frettlby's mistress, but still—" "His mistress!" said Fitzgerald, looking up sharply. "Then you don't know all." "What do you mean? Was she not his mistress?" "No, his wife!" Calton sprang to his feet and gave a cry of surprise. "His wife!" Fitzgerald nodded. "Why, Mother Guttersnipe did not know this. She thought Rosanna was his mistress." "He kept his marriage secret," answered Brian, "and as his wife ran away with someone else shortly afterwards, he never revealed it." "I understand now," said the barrister slowly. "For if Mark Frettlby was lawfully married to Rosanna Moore, Madge is illegitimate." "Yes, and she now occupies the place which Sal Rawlins, or rather Sal Frettlby, ought to." "Poor girl!" said Calton, a little sadly. "But all this does not explain the mystery of Whyte's murder." "I will tell you that," said Fitzgerald quickly. "When Rosanna left her husband she ran away to England with some young fellow, and when he got tired of her she returned to the stage, and became famous as a burlesque actress, under the name of Musette. There she met Whyte, as your friend found out, and they came out here for the purpose of extorting money from Frettlby. When they arrived in Melbourne, Rosanna let Whyte do all the business, and kept herself quiet. She gave her marriage certificate to Whyte, and he had it on him the night he was murdered." "Then Gorby was right," interposed Calton eagerly. "The man to whom those papers were valuable did murder Whyte." "Can you doubt it? And that man was—" "Not Mark Frettlby!" burst out Calton. "Surely not Mark Frettlby!" Brian nodded. "Yes, Mark Frettlby." There was a silence for a few moments, Calton being too much startled by the revelation to say anything. "When did you discover this?" he asked, after a pause. "At the time you first came to see me in prison," said Brian. "I had no suspicion till then, but when you said that Whyte was murdered for the sake of certain papers, I, knowing full well what they were and to whom they were of value, guessed immediately that Frettlby had killed Whyte in order to obtain them and to keep his secret." "There can be no doubt of it," said the barrister, with a sigh. "So this is the reason Frettlby wanted Madge to marry Whyte. Her hand was to be the price of his silence. When he withdrew his consent Whyte threatened him with exposure. I remember he left the house in a very excited state on the night he was murdered. Frettlby must have followed him up to town, got into the cab with him, and after killing him with chloroform, must have taken the marriage certificate from his secret pocket, and escaped." Brian rose to his feet and walked rapidly up and down the room. "Now you can understand what a hell my life has been for the last few months," he said, "knowing that he had committed the crime, and yet I had to sit with him, eat with him, and drink with him, with the knowledge that he was a murderer, and Madge, his daughter—" Just then a knock came to his door, and Mrs. Sampson entered it with a telegram, which she handed to Brian. He tore it open as she withdrew, and glancing over it, gave a cry of horror, and let it flutter to his feet. Calton turned rapidly on hearing his cry, and seeing him fall into a chair with a white face, snatched up the telegram and read it. When he did so, his face grew as pale and startled as Fitzgerald's, and lifting his hand, he said solemnly, "It is the judgment of God." End of chapter 29. Read by Sabella Denton. For more free audiobooks or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 30 of Mystery of a Hansom Cab by Fergus Hume. Read for LibriVox.org into the public domain. Nemesis. Men, according to the old Greek, are the sport of the gods, who, enthroned on high Olympus, put evil desires into the hearts of mortals, and when evil actions were the outcome of evil thoughts, amused themselves by watching the ineffectual efforts made by their victims to escape a relentless deity called Nemesis, who exacted a penalty for their evil deeds. It was no doubt very amusing to the gods, but it is questionable if the men found it so. They had their revenge, however, for weary of plaguing puny mortals, who whimpered and cried when they saw how they could not escape. The inevitable Nemesis turned her attention from actors to spectators, and made a clean sweep of the whole Olympian hierarchy. She smashed their altars, pulled down their statues, and after she had completed her malicious work, found that she had, vulgarly speaking, been cutting off her nose to spite her face, for she too became an object of derision and of disbelief, and was forced to retire to the same obscurity to which she had relegated the other deities. But men found out that she had not been altogether useless as a scapegoat upon which to lay the blame of their own shortcomings, so they created a new deity called Fate, and laid any misfortune which happened to them to her charge. Her worship is still very popular, especially among lazy and unlucky people, who never bestir themselves, on the ground that whether they do so or not, their lives are already settled by Fate. After all, the true religion of Fate has been preached by George Eliot, when she says that our lives are the outcome of our actions. Set up any idol you please upon which to lay the blame of unhappy lives and baffled ambitions, but the true cause is to be found in men themselves. Every action, good or bad, which we do has its corresponding reward, and Mark Frettlby found it so, for the sins of his youth were now being punished in his old age. No doubt he had sinned gaily enough in that far-off time when life's cup was still brimming with wine, and no asp hid among the roses, but Nemesis had been an unseen spectator of all his thoughtless actions, and now she came to demand her just dues. He felt somewhat as Faust must have felt when Mephistopheles suggested a visit to Hades, in repayment of those years of magic youth and magic power. So long ago it seemed since he had married Rosanna Moore, that he almost persuaded himself that it had only been a dream, a pleasant dream with a disagreeable awakening. When she had left him he had tried to forget her, recognizing how unworthy she was of a good man's love. He heard that she had died in a London hospital, and with a passionate sigh for a perished love, he had dismissed her from his thoughts forever. His second marriage had turned out a happy one, and he regretted the death of his wife deeply. Afterwards all his love centred in his daughter, and he thought he would be able to spend his declining years in peace. This, however, was not to be, and he was thunderstruck when White arrived from England with the information that his first wife still lived, and that the daughter of his second was illegitimate. Sooner than risk exposure, Frettlby agreed to anything, but White's demands became too exorbitant, and he refused to comply with them. On White's death he again breathed freely, when suddenly a second possessor of his fatal secret started up in the person of Roger Moreland. As the murder of Duncan had to be followed by that of Banquo, in order to render Macbeth safe, so he foresaw that while Roger Moreland lived his life would be one long misery. He knew that the friend of the murdered man would be his master, and would never leave him during his life, while after his death he would probably publish the whole ghastly story, and defame the memory of the widely respected Mark Frettlby. What is it that Shakespeare says? Good name in man or woman is the immediate jewel of their souls. And after all these years of spotless living and generous use of his wealth, was he to be dragged down to the depths of infamy and degradation by a man like Moreland? Already in fancy he heard the jeering cries of his fellow men, and saw the finger of scorn point at him. He, the great Mark Frettlby, famous throughout Australia for his honesty, integrity, and generosity. No, it could not be, and yet this would surely happen unless he took means to prevent it. The day after he had seen Moreland, and knew that his secret was no longer safe, since it was in the power of a man who might reveal it at any moment in a drunken fit, or out of sheer maliciousness, He sat at his desk writing. After a time he laid down his pen, and taking up a portrait of his dead wife which stood just in front of him, he stared at it long and earnestly. As he did so, his mind went back to the time when he had first met and loved her. Even as Faust had entered into the purity and serenity of Gretchen's chamber, out of the coarseness and profligacy of Auerbach's cellar, so he, leaving behind him the wild life of his youth, had entered into the peace and quiet of a domestic home. The old feverish life with Rosanna Moore seemed to be as unsubstantial and chimerical as no doubt his union with Lilith after he met Eve seemed to Adam in the old rabbinical legend. There seemed to be only one way open to him, by which he could escape the relentless fate which dogged his steps. He would write a confession of everything from the time he had first met Rosanna, and then death. He would cut the Gordian knot of all his difficulties, and then his secret would be safe. Safe? No, it could not be while Moreland lived. When he was dead, Moreland would see Madge and embitter her life with the story of her father's sins. Yes, he must live to protect her, and drag his weary chain of bitter remembrance through life, always with that terrible sword of Damocles hanging over him. But still he would write out his confession, and after his death, whenever it may happen, it might help if not altogether to exculpate, at least to secure some pity for a man who had been hardly dealt with by fate. His resolution taken, he put it into force at once, and sat all day at his desk filling page after page with the history of his past life, which was so bitter to him. He started at first languidly, and as in the performance of an unpleasant but necessary duty. Soon, however, he became interested in it, and took a peculiar pleasure in putting down every minute circumstance which made the case stronger against himself. He dealt with it not as a criminal, but as prosecutor, and painted his conduct as much blacker than it had really been. Towards the end of the day, however, after reading over the earlier sheets, he experienced a revulsion of feeling, seeing how severe he had been on himself, so he wrote a defence of his conduct, showing that fate had been too strong for him. It was a weak argument to bring forward, but still he felt it was the only one that he could make. It was quite dark when he had finished, and while sitting in the twilight, looking dreamily at the sheets scattered all over his desk, he heard a knock at the door, and his daughter's voice asking if he was coming to dinner. All day long he had closed his door against everyone, but now, his task being ended, he collected all the closely written sheets together, placed them in a drawer of his escritoire, which he locked, and then opened the door. "Dear papa," cried Madge, as she entered rapidly, and threw her arms around his neck, "what have you been doing here all day by yourself?" "Writing," returned her father, laconically, as he gently removed her arms. "Why, I thought you were ill," she answered, looking at him apprehensively. "No, dear," he replied quietly, "not ill, but worried." "I knew that dreadful man who came last night had told you something to worry you. Who is he?" "Oh, a friend of mine," answered Frettlby, with hesitation. "What, Roger Moreland?" Her father started. "How do you know it was Roger Moreland?" "Oh, Brian recognized him as he went out." Mark Frettlby hesitated for a few moments, then busied himself with the papers on his desk, as he replied in a low voice, "You're right, it was Roger Moreland. He is very hard up, and as he was a friend of poor White's, he asked me to assist him, which I did." He hated to hear himself telling such a deliberate falsehood, but there was no help for it. Madge must never know the truth so long as he could conceal it. "Just like you," said Madge, kissing him lightly with filial pride, "the best and kindest of men." He shivered slightly as he felt her caress, and thought how she would recoil from him did she know all. After all, says some cynical writer, the illusions of youth are mostly due to the want of experience. Madge, ignorant in great measure of the world, cherished her pleasant illusions, though many of them had been destroyed by the trials of the past year, and her father longed to keep her in this frame of mind. "Now go down to dinner, my dear," he said, leading her to the door. "I will follow soon." "Don't be long," replied his daughter, "or I shall come up again." And she ran down the stairs, her heart feeling strangely light. Her father looked after her until she vanished, then heaving a regretful sigh returned to his study, and taking out the scattered papers fastened them together and endorsed them. "My confession." He then placed them in an envelope, sealed it, and put it back in the desk. "If all that is in that packet were known," he said aloud, as he left the room, "what would the world say?" That night he was singularly brilliant at the dinner table. Generally a very reticent and grave man, on this night he laughed and talked so gaily that the very servants noticed the change. The fact was, he felt a sense of relief at having unburdened his mind, and felt as though, by writing out that confession, he had laid the spectre which had haunted him for so long. His daughter was delighted at the change in his spirits, but the old Scotch nurse, who had been in the house since Madge was a baby, shook her head. "He's fey," she said gravely. "He's not long for the world." Of course she was laughed at. People who believe in presentiments generally are, but nevertheless she held firmly to her opinion. Mr. Frettlby went to bed early that night, the excitement of the last few days and the feverish gaiety in which he had lately indulged proving too strong for him. No sooner had he laid his head on his pillow than he dropped off to sleep at once, and forgot in placid slumber the troubles and worries of his waking hours. It was only 9 o'clock, so Madge stayed by herself in the great drawing-room, and read a new novel, which was then creating a sensation, called Sweet Violet Eyes. It belied its reputation, however, for it was very soon thrown down on the table with a look of disgust, and rising from her seat, Madge walked up and down the room, and wished some good fairy would hint to Brian that he was wanted. If man is a gregarious animal, how much more, then, is a woman? This is not a conundrum, but a simple truth. A female Robinson Crusoe, says a writer who prided himself on being a keen observer of human nature, a female Robinson Crusoe would have gone mad for want of something to talk to. This remark, though severe, nevertheless contains several grains of truth, for women as a rule talk more than men. They are more sociable, and a Miss Misanthrope, in spite of Justin McCarthy's, is unknown, at least in civilized communities. Miss Frettlby, being neither misanthropic nor dumb, began to long for someone to talk to, and ringing the bell ordered Sal to be sent in. The two girls had become great friends, and Madge, though by 2 years the younger, assumed the role of mentor, and under her guidance Sal was rapidly improving. It was a strange irony of fate which brought together these two children of the same father, each with such different histories, the one reared in luxury and affluence, never having known want, the other dragged up in the gutter, all unsexed and besmirched by the life she had led. The whirligig of time brings in its revenges, and it was the last thing in the world Mark Frettlby would have thought of seeing, Rosanna Moore's child, whom he fancied dead, under the same roof as his daughter Madge. On receiving Madge's message Sal came to the drawing-room, and the two were soon chatting amicably together. The room was almost in darkness, only one lamp being lighted, Mr. Frettlby very sensibly detesting gas, with its glaring light, and had nothing but lamps in his drawing-room. At the end of the apartment, where Sal and Madge were seated, there was a small table. On it stood a large lamp, with an opaque globe, which, having a shade over it, threw a soft and subdued circle of light round the table, leaving the rest of the room in a kind of semi-darkness. Near this sat Madge and Sal, talking gaily, and away on the left-hand side they could see the door open, and a warm flood of light pouring in from the hall. They had been talking together for some time, when Sal's quick ear caught a footfall on the soft carpet, and turning rapidly, she saw a tall figure advancing down the room. Madge saw it too, and started up in surprise on recognizing her father. He was clothed in his dressing-gown, and carried some papers in his hand. "Why, papa," said Madge in surprise, "Hush!" whispered Sal, grasping her arm. "He's asleep." And so he was. In accordance with the dictates of the excited brain, the weary body had risen from the bed and wandered about the house. The two girls, drawing back into the shadow, watched him with bated breath as he came slowly down the room. In a few moments he was within the circle of light, and moving noiselessly along, he laid the papers he carried on the table. They were in a large blue envelope much worn, with writing in red ink on it. Sal recognized it at once as the one she had seen in the possession of the dead woman, and with an instinctive feeling that there was something wrong, she tried to draw Madge back, as she watched her father's action with an intensity of feeling which held her spellbound. Frettlby opened the envelope, and took therefrom a yellow frayed piece of paper, which he spread out on the table. Madge bent forward to see it, but Sal, with a sudden terror, drew her back. "For God's sake, no!" she cried. But it was too late. Madge had caught sight of the names on the paper, Marriage, Rosanna Moore, Mark Frettlby, and the whole awful truth flashed upon her. These were the papers Rosanna Moore had handed to White. White had been murdered by the man to whom the papers were of value. "Oh, my father!" She staggered blindly forward, and then, with one piercing shriek, fell to the ground. In doing so, she struck against her father, who was still standing beside the table. Awakened suddenly, with that wild cry in his ears, he opened his eyes wide, put out feeble hands as if to keep something back, and with a strangled cry fell dead on the floor beside his daughter. Sal, horror-struck, did not lose her presence of mind, but snatching the papers off the table, she thrust them into her pocket, and then called aloud for the servants. But they, already attracted by Madge's wild cry, came hurrying in, to find Mark Frettlby, the millionaire, lying dead, and his daughter in a faint beside her father's corpse. End of chapter 30. Read by Sabella Denton. For more free audiobooks or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 31 of Mystery of a Hansom Cab by Fergus Hume. Read for LibriVox.org into the public domain. Hush Money. As soon as Brian received the telegram which announced the death of Mark Frettlby, he put on his hat, stepped into Calton's trap, and drove along to the St. Kilda station in Flinders Street with that gentleman. There Calton dismissed his trap, sending a note to his clerk with the groom, and went down to St. Kilda with Fitzgerald. On arrival they found the whole house perfectly quiet and orderly, owing to the excellent management of Sal Rawlins. She had taken the command in everything, and although the servants, knowing her antecedents, were disposed to resent her doing so, yet such were her administrative powers and strong will, that they obeyed her implicitly. Mark Frettlby's body had been taken up to his bedroom, Madge had been put to bed, and Dr. Chinston and Brian sent for. When they arrived they could not help expressing their admiration at the capital way in which Sal Rawlins had managed things. "She's a clever girl, that," whispered Calton to Fitzgerald. "Curious thing she should have taken up her proper position in her father's house. Fate is a deal cleverer than we mortals think her." Brian was about to reply when Dr. Chinston entered the room. His face was very grave, and Fitzgerald looked at him in alarm. "Madge, Miss Frettlby," he faltered. "Is very ill," replied the doctor. "Has an attack of brain fever. I can't answer for the consequences yet." Brian sat down on the sofa, and stared at the doctor in a dazed sort of way. Madge dangerously ill, perhaps dying. What if she were to die, and he to lose the true-hearted woman who stood so nobly by him in his trouble? "Cheer up," said Chinston, patting him on the shoulder. "While there's life there's hope, and whatever human aid can do to save her will be done." Brian grasped the doctor's hand in silence, his heart being too full to speak. "How did Frettlby die?" asked Calton. "Heart disease," said Chinston. "His heart was very much affected, as I discovered a week or so ago. It appears he was walking in his sleep, and entering the drawing-room he alarmed Miss Frettlby, who screamed, and must have touched him. He awoke suddenly, and the natural consequences followed. He dropped down dead." "What alarmed Miss Frettlby?" asked Brian in a low voice, covering his face with his hand. "The sight of her father walking in his sleep, I suppose," said Chinston, buttoning his glove, "and the shock of his death, which took place indirectly through her, accounts for the brain fever." "Madge Frettlby is not the woman to scream and waken a somnambulist," said Calton, decidedly, knowing as she did the danger. "There must be some other reason." "This young woman will tell you all about it," said Chinston, nodding towards Sal, who entered the room at this moment. "She was present, and since then has managed things admirably, and now I must go," he said, shaking hands with Calton and Fitzgerald. "Keep up your heart, my boy. I'll pull her through yet." After the doctor had gone, Calton turned sharply to Sal Rawlins, who stood waiting to be addressed. "Well," he said briskly, "can you tell us what startled Miss Frettlby?" "I can, sir," she answered quietly. "I was in the drawing-room when Mr. Frettlby died, but we had better go up to the study." "Why?" asked Calton in surprise, as he and Fitzgerald followed her upstairs. "Because, sir," she said, when they had entered the study and she had locked the door, "I don't want any one but yourselves to know what I tell you." "More mystery," muttered Calton as he glanced at Brian, and took his seat at the escritoire. "Mr. Frettlby went to bed early last night," said Sal calmly, "and Miss Madge and I were talking together in the drawing-room, when he entered, walking in his sleep, and carrying some papers." Both Calton and Fitzgerald started, and the latter grew pale. "He came down the room, and spread out a paper on the table where the lamp was. Miss Madge bent forward to see what it was. I tried to stop her, but it was too late. She gave a scream, and fell on the floor. In doing so she happened to touch her father. He awoke, and fell down dead." "And the papers?" asked Calton uneasily. Sal did not answer, but producing them from her pocket, laid them in his hands. Brian bent forward, as Calton opened the envelope in silence, but both gave vent to an exclamation of horror at seeing the certificate of marriage, which they knew Rosanna Moore had given to White. Their worst suspicions were confirmed, and Brian turned away his head, afraid to meet the barrister's eye. The latter folded up the papers thoughtfully, and put them in his pocket. "You know what these are?" he asked Sal, eyeing her keenly. "I could hardly help knowing," she answered. "It proves that Rosanna Moore was Mr. Frettlby's wife, and—" She hesitated. "Go on," said Brian in a harsh tone, looking up. "And they were the papers she gave Mr. White." "Well?" Sal was silent for a moment, and then looked up with a flush. "You needn't think I'm going to split," she said indignantly, recurring to her Bourke Street slang in the excitement of the moment. "I know what you know, but I'll be as silent as the grave." "Thank you," said Brian fervently, taking her secret. "I know you love her too well to betray this terrible secret." "I would be a nice 'un, I would," said Sal with scorn, "after her lifting me out of the gutter to round on her, a poor girl like me, without a friend or relative, now Gran's dead." Calton looked up quickly. It was plain Sal was quite ignorant that Rosanna Moore was her mother. So much the better, they would keep her in ignorance, perhaps not altogether, but it would be folly to undeceive her at present. "I'm going to see Miss Madge now," she said, going to the door, "and I won't see you again. She's getting light-headed, and might let it out, but I'll not let any one in but myself." And so saying, she left the room. "Cast thy bread upon the waters," said Calton, oracularly. "The kindness of Miss Frettlby to that poor waif is already bearing fruit. Gratitude is the rarest of qualities, rarer even than modesty." Fitzgerald made no answer, but stared out of the window, and thought of his darling lying sick unto death, and he unable to do nothing to save her. "Well," said Calton sharply. "Oh, I beg your pardon," said Fitzgerald, turning in confusion. "I suppose the will must be read, and all that sort of thing." "Yes," answered the barrister. "I am one of the executors." "And the others?" "Yourself and Chinston," answered Calton. "So I suppose," turning to the desk, "we can look at his papers, and see that all is straight." "Yes, I suppose so," replied Brian mechanically, his thoughts far away, and then he turned again to the window. Suddenly Calton gave vent to an exclamation of surprise, and turning hastily, Brian saw him holding a thick roll of papers in his hand, which he had taken out of the drawer. "Look here, Fitzgerald," he said, greatly excited. "Here is Frettlby's confession. Look!" And he held it up. Brian sprang forward in astonishment. So at last the hansom cab mystery was to be cleared up. These sheets, no doubt, contained the whole narration of the crime, and how it was committed. "We will read it, of course," he said hesitatingly, half hoping that Calton would propose to destroy it at once. "Yes," answered Calton, "the three executors must read it, and then we will burn it." "That will be the better way," answered Brian gloomily. "Frettlby is dead, and the law can do nothing in the matter, so it would be best to avoid the scandal of publicity. But why tell Chinston?" "We must," said Calton decidedly. "He will be sure to gather the truth from Madge's ravings, and he may as well know all. He is quite safe, and will be as silent as the grave. But I am more sorry to tell Kilsip." "The detective? Good God, Calton, surely you will not do so?" "I must," replied the barrister quietly. "Kilsip is firmly persuaded that Moreland committed the crime, and I have the same dread of his pertinacity as you had of mine. He may find out all." "What must be," said Fitzgerald, clenching his hands. "But I hope no one else will find out this miserable story. There's Moreland, for instance." "Ah, true," said Calton, thoughtfully. "He called and saw Frettlby the other night, you say?" "Yes. I wonder what for." "There is only one answer," said the barrister slowly. "He must have seen Frettlby following White when he left the hotel, and wanted hush money." "I wonder if he got it," observed Fitzgerald. "Oh, I'll soon find that out," answered Calton, opening the drawer again, and taking out the dead man's cheque-book. "Let me see what cheques have been drawn lately." Most of the blocks were filled up for small amounts, and one or two for 100 or so. Calton could find no large sum such as Moreland would have demanded. When, at the very end of the book, he found a cheque torn off, leaving the blocked slip quite blank. "There you are," he said triumphantly, holding out the book to Fitzgerald. "He wasn't such a fool as to write the amount on the block, but tore the cheque out, and wrote in the sum required." "And what's to be done about it?" "Let him keep it, of course," answered Calton, shrugging his shoulders. "It's the only way to secure his silence." "I expect he cashed it yesterday, and is off by this time," said Brian, after a moment's pause. "So much the better for us," said Calton, grimly. "But I don't think he's off, or Kilsip would have let me know. We must tell him, or he'll get everything out of Moreland, and the consequences will be that all Melbourne will know the story. whereas, by showing him the confession, we get him to leave Moreland alone, and thus secure silence in both cases. I suppose we must see Chinston? Yes, of course. I will telegraph to him and Kilsip to come up to my office this afternoon at 3 o'clock, and then we will settle the whole matter. And Sal Rawlins? Oh, I quite forgot about her, said Calton in a perplexed voice. She knows nothing about her parents, and of course Mark Frettlby died in the belief that she was dead. We must tell Madge, said Brian gloomily. There is no help for it. Sal is by rights the heiress to the money of her dead father. That depends upon the will, replied Calton dryly. If it specifies that the money is left to my daughter, Margaret Frettlby, Sal Rawlins can have no claim, and if such is the case, it will be no good telling her who she is. And what's to be done? Sal Rawlins, went on the barrister, without noticing the interruption, has evidently never given a thought to her father or mother, as the old hag, no doubt, swore they were dead. So I think it will be best to keep silent. That is, if no money is left to her, and as her father thought her dead, I don't think there will be any. In that case it would be best to settle an income on her. You can easily find a pretext and let the matter rest. But suppose, in accordance with the wording of the will, she is entitled to all the money? In that case, said Calton gravely, there is only one course open. She must be told everything, and the dividing of the money left to her generosity. But I don't think you need be alarmed. I'm pretty sure Madge is the heiress. It's not the money I think about, said Brian hastily. I take Madge without a penny. My boy, said the barrister, placing his hand kindly on Brian's shoulder, when you marry Madge Frettlby, you will get what is better than money, a heart of gold. End of chapter 31. Read by Sabella Denton. For more free audiobooks or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 32 of Mystery of a Hansom Cab by Fergus Hume. Read for LibriVox.org into the public domain. De mortuis nil nisi bonum. Nothing is certain but the unforeseen, so says a French proverb, and judging from the unexpected things which daily happen to us, it is without doubt a very true one. If any one had told Madge Frettlby one day that she would be stretched on a bed of sickness the next, and would be quite oblivious of the world and its doings, she would have laughed the prophet to scorn. Yet it was so, and she was tossing and turning on a bed of pain to which the couch of Procustus was one of roses. Sal sat beside her, ever watchful of her wants, and listened to the bright hours of the day, or the still ones of the night, to the wild and incoherent words which issued from her lips. She incessantly called on her father to save himself, and then would talk about Brian, and sing snatches of song, or would sob broken sentences about her dead mother, until the heart of the listener ached to hear her. No one was allowed into the room except Sal, and when Dr. Chinston heard the things she was saying, although used to such cases, he recoiled. "There is blood on your hands," cried Madge, sitting up in bed, with her hair all tangled and falling over her shoulders. "Red blood, and you cannot wash it off. Oh, Cain, God save him! Brian, you are not guilty. My father killed him. God, God!" And she fell back on her disordered pillows, weeping bitterly. Dr. Chinston did not say anything, but shortly afterwards took his leave, after telling Sal on no account to let any one see the patient. "'Tain't likely," said Sal in a disgusted tone, as she closed the door after him. "I'm not a viper to sting the bosom as fed me." From which it may be gathered that she was advancing rapidly in her education. Meanwhile Dr. Chinston had received Calton's telegram, and was considerably astonished thereat. He was still more so when, on arriving at the office at the time appointed, he found Calton and Fitzgerald were not alone, but a third man whom he had never seen was with them. The latter Calton introduced to him as Mr. Kilsip, of the detective office, a fact which made the worthy doctor uneasy, as he could in no wise divine the meaning of it. However, he made no remark, but took the seat handed to him by Mr. Calton, and prepared to listen. Calton locked the door of the office, and then went back to his desk, having the other three seated before him in a kind of semicircle. "In the first place," said Calton to the doctor, "I have to inform you that you are one of the executors under the will of the late Mr. Frettlby, and that is why I asked you to come here to-day. The other executors are Mr. Fitzgerald and myself." "Oh, indeed," murmured the doctor politely. "And now," said Calton, looking at him, "do you remember the hansom cab murder, which caused such a sensation some months ago?" "Yes, I do," replied the doctor, rather astonished. "But what has that to do with the will?" "Nothing to do with the will," answered Calton gravely, "but the fact is, Mr. Frettlby was implicated in the affair." Dr. Chinston glanced inquiringly at Brian, but that gentleman shook his head. "It has nothing to do with my arrest," he said sadly. Madge's words, uttered in her delirium, flashed across the doctor's memory. "What do you mean?" he gasped, pushing back his chair. "How was he implicated?" "That I cannot tell you," answered Calton, "until I read his confession." "Ah!" said Kilsip, becoming very attentive. "Yes," said Calton, turning to Kilsip, "your hunt after Moreland is a wild goose chase, for the murderer of Oliver Whyte is discovered." "Discovered!" cried Kilsip and the doctor in one breath. "Yes, and his name is Mark Frettlby." Kilsip shot a glance of disdain out of his bright black eyes, and gave a low laugh of disbelief, but the doctor pushed back his chair furiously, and arose to his feet. "This is monstrous!" he cried in a rage. "I won't sit still and hear this accusation against my dead friend." "Unfortunately, it is too true," said Brian, sadly. "How dare you say so?" said Chinston, turning angrily on him. "And you going to marry his daughter?" "There is only one way to settle the question," said Calton, coldly. "We must read his confession." "But why the detective?" asked the doctor ungraciously, as he took his seat. "Because I want him to hear for himself that Mr. Frettlby committed the crime, that he may keep silence." "Not till I've arrested him," said Kilsip, determinedly. "But he's dead," said Brian. "I'm speaking of Roger Moreland," retorted Kilsip, "for he and no other murdered Oliver Whyte." "That's a much more likely story," Chinston said. "I tell you," said Calton, vehemently, "God knows I would like to preserve Mark Frettlby's good name, and it is with this object I have brought you all together. I will read the confession, and when you know the truth, I want you to keep silent about it, as Mark Frettlby is dead, and the publication of his crime can do no good to any one." "I know," resumed Calton, addressing the detective, "that you are fully convinced in your own mind that you are right and I am wrong, but what if I tell you that Mark Frettlby died holding those very papers for the sake of which the crime was committed?" Kilsip's face lengthened considerably. "What were the papers?" "The marriage certificate of Mark Frettlby and Rosanna Moore, the woman who died in the back slum." Kilsip was not often astonished, but he was so now, and Dr. Chinston fell back in his chair, staring at the barrister in blank amazement. "And what's more," went on Calton, triumphantly, "do you know that Moreland went to Frettlby 2 nights ago and obtained a certain sum for hush money?" "What!" cried Kilsip. "Yes, Moreland, in coming out of the hotel, evidently saw Frettlby, and threatened to expose him unless he paid for his silence." "Very strange," murmured Kilsip to himself, with a disappointed look on his face. "But why did Moreland keep still so long?" "I cannot tell you," replied Calton, "but no doubt the confession will explain all." "Then for heaven's sake read it," broke in Dr. Chinston, impatiently. "I'm quite in the dark, and all your talk is Greek to me." "One moment," said Kilsip, dragging a bundle from under his chair, and untying it. "If you are right, what about this?" and he held up a light coat, very much soiled and weather-worn. "Whose is that?" asked Calton, startled. "Not Whyte's?" "Yes, Whyte's," repeated Kilsip, with great satisfaction. "I found it in the Fitzroy Gardens, near the gate that opens to George Street, East Melbourne. It was up in a fir tree." "Then Mr. Frettlby must have got out at Powlett Street, and walked down George Street, and then through the Fitzroy Gardens into town," said Calton. Kilsip took no heed of the remark, but took a small bottle out of the pocket of the coat and held it up. "I also found this," he said. "Chloroform!" cried every one, guessing at once that it was the missing bottle. "Exactly," said Kilsip, replacing it. "This is what the bottle which contained the poison used by—well, call him the murderer. The name of the chemist being on the label, I went to him and found out who bought it. Now, who do you think?" with a look of triumph. "Frettlby," said Calton, decidedly. "No, Moreland," burst out Chinston, greatly excited. "Neither," retorted the detective, calmly. "The man who purchased this was Oliver Whyte himself." "Himself?" echoed Brian, now thoroughly surprised, as indeed were all the others. "Yes, I had no trouble in finding out that, thanks to the Poisons Act. As I knew no one would be so foolish as to carry chloroform about in his pocket for any length of time, I mentioned the day of the murder as the probable date it was bought. The chemist turned up in his book, and found that Whyte was the purchaser." "And what did he buy it for?" asked Chinston. "That's more than I can tell you," said Kilsip, with a shrug of his shoulders. "It's down in the book as being bought for medicinal usage, which may mean anything." "The law requires a witness," observed Calton, cautiously. "Who was the witness?" Again Kilsip smiled triumphantly. "I think I can guess," said Fitzgerald. "Moreland?" Kilsip nodded. "And I suppose," remarked Calton, in a slightly sarcastic tone, "that is another of your proofs against Moreland. He knew that Whyte had chloroform on him, therefore he followed him that night and murdered him?" "Well, it's a lot of nonsense," said the barrister, impatiently. There's nothing against Moreland to implicate him. If he killed White, what made him go and see Frettlby? But, said Kilsip, nodding sagely in his head, if, as Moreland says, he had White's coat in his possession before the murder, how is it that I should discover it afterwards up a fir tree in the Fitzroy Gardens, with an empty chloroform bottle in the pocket? He may have been an accomplice, suggested Calton. What's the good of all this conjecturing? Said Chinston impatiently, now thoroughly tired of the discussion. Read the confession, and we will soon know the truth, without all this talk. Calton assented, and all having settled themselves to listen, he began to read what the dead man had written. End of chapter 32. Read by Sabella Denton. For more free audiobooks or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 33 of Mystery of a Hansom Cab by Fergus Hume. Read for LibriVox.org into the public domain. The Confession. What I am now about to write is set forth by me so that the true circumstances connected with the Hansom Cab tragedy, which took place in Melbourne in 18 may be known. I owe a confession, particularly to Brian Fitzgerald, seeing that he was accused of the crime. Although I know he was rightfully acquitted of the charge, yet I wish him to know all about the case, though I am convinced, from his altered demeanour towards me, that he is better acquainted with it than he chooses to confess. In order to account for the murder of Oliver White, I must go back to the beginning of my life in this colony, and show how the series of events began which culminated in the committal of the crime. Should it be necessary to make this confession public, in the interest of justice, I can say nothing against such a course being taken, but I would be grateful if it could be suppressed, both on account of my good name and of my dear daughter Margaret, whose love and affection has so soothed and brightened my life. If, however, she should be informed of the contents of these pages, I ask her to deal leniently with the memory of one who was sorely tried and tempted. I came to the colony of Victoria, or rather, as it was called then, New South Wales, in the year 18. I had been in a merchant's office in London, but not finding much opportunity for advancement, I looked about to see if I could better myself. I heard of this new land across the ocean, and though it was not then the El Dorado which it afterwards turned out, and, truth to tell, had rather a shady name, owing to the transportation of convicts, yet I longed to go there and start a new life. Unhappily, however, I had not the means, and saw nothing better before me than the dreary life of a London clerk, as it was impossible that I could save out of the small salary I got. Just at this time, an old maiden aunt of my mother's died, and left £100 to me. With this, I came out to Australia, determined to become a rich man. I stayed some time in Sydney, and then came over to Port Phillip, now so widely known as marvellous Melbourne, where I intended to pitch my tent. I saw that it was a young and rising colony, though of course, coming as I did before the days of the gold diggings, I never dreamt it would spring up, as it has done since, into a nation. I was careful and saving in those days, and indeed I think it was the happiest time of my life. I bought land whenever I could scrape the money together, and at the time of the gold rush was considered well-to-do. When, however, the cry that gold had been discovered was raised, and the eyes of all the nations were turned to Australia, with her glittering treasures, men poured in from all parts of the world, and the golden age commenced. I began to grow rich rapidly, and was soon pointed out as the wealthiest man in the colonies. I bought a station, and leaving the riotous, feverish Melbourne life, went to live on it. I enjoyed myself there, for the wild, open-air life had great charms for me, and there was a sense of freedom to which I had hitherto been a stranger. But man is a gregarious animal, and I, growing weary of solitude and communings with Mother Nature, came down on a visit to Melbourne, where, with companions as gay as myself, I spent my money freely, and, as the phrase goes, saw life. After confessing that I loved the pure life of the country, it sounds strange to say I enjoyed the wild life of the town, but I did. I was neither a Joseph nor a St. Anthony, and I was delighted with Bohemia, with its good fellowship and charming suppers, which took place in the small hours of the morning, when wit and humour reigned supreme. It was at one of these suppers that I first met Rosanna Moore, the woman who was destined to curse my existence. She was a burlesque actress, and all the young fellows in those days were madly in love with her. She was not exactly what was called beautiful, but there was a brilliancy and fascination about her which few could resist. On first seeing her I did not admire her much, but laughed at my companions as they raved about her. On becoming personally acquainted with her, however, I found that her powers of fascination had not been overrated, and I ended by falling desperately in love with her. I made inquiries about her private life, and found that it was irreproachable, as she was guarded by a veritable dragon of a mother, who would let no one approach her daughter. I need not tell you about my courtship, as these phases of a man's life are generally the same, but it will be sufficient to prove the depth of my passion for her when I say I was determined to make her my wife. It was on condition, however, that the marriage should be kept secret until such time as I should choose to reveal it. My reason for such a course was this. My father was still alive, and he, being a rigid Presbyterian, would never have forgiven me for having married a woman of the stage. So, as he was old and feeble, I did not wish him to learn that I had done so, fearing that the shock would be too much for him in his then state of health. I told Rosanna I would marry her, but wanted her to leave her mother, who was a perfect fury, and not an agreeable person to live with. As I was rich, young, and not bad-looking, Rosanna consented, and during an engagement she had in Sydney, I went over there and married her. She never told her mother she had married me, why I do not know, as I laid no restriction on her doing so. The mother made a great noise over the matter, but I gave Rosanna a large sum of money for her, and this the old harridan accepted, and left for New Zealand. Rosanna went with me to my station, where we lived as man and wife, though in Melbourne she was supposed to be my mistress. At last, feeling degraded in my own eyes at the way in which I was supposed to be living, I wanted to reveal our secret, but this Rosanna would not consent to. I was astonished at this, and never could discover the reason, but in many ways Rosanna was an enigma to me. She then grew weary of the quiet country life, and longed to return to the glitter and glare of the footlights. This I refused to let her do, and from that moment she took a dislike to me. A child was born, and for a time she was engrossed with it, but soon wearied of the new plaything, and again pressed me to allow her to return to the stage. I again refused, and we became estranged from one another. I grew gloomy and irritable, and was accustomed to take long rides by myself, frequently being away for days. There was a great friend of mine who owned the next station, a fine, handsome young fellow called Frank Kelly, with a gay, sunny disposition, and a wonderful flow of humour. When he found I was so much away, thinking Rosanna was only my mistress, he began to console her, and succeeded so well that one day, on my return from a ride, I found she had fled with him, and had taken the child with her. She left a letter saying that she had never really cared for me, but had married me for my money. She would keep our marriage secret, and was going to return to the stage. I followed my false friend and false wife down to Melbourne, but arrived too late, as they had just left for England. Disgusted with the manner in which I had been treated, I plunged into a whirl of dissipation, trying to drown the memory of my married life. My friends, of course, thought my loss amounted to no more than that of a mistress, and I soon began myself to doubt that I had ever been married, so far away and visionary did my life of the previous year seem. I continued my fast life for about 6 months, when suddenly I was arrested upon the brink of destruction by an angel. I say this advisedly, for if ever there was an angel upon earth, it was she who afterwards became my wife. She was the daughter of a doctor, and it was her influence which drew me back from the dreary path of profligacy and dissipation which I was then leading. I paid her great attention, and we were in fact looked upon as good as engaged, but I knew that I was still linked to that accursed woman, and could not ask her to be my wife. At this second crisis of my life fate again intervened, for I received a letter from England, which informed me that Rosanna Moore had been run over in the streets of London, and had died in an hospital. The writer was a young doctor who had attended her, and I wrote home to him, begging him to send out a certificate of her death, so that I might be sure she was no more. He did so, and also enclosed an account of the accident, which had appeared in a newspaper. Then, indeed, I felt that I was free, and closing, as I thought, for ever the darkest page of my life's history, I began to look forward to the future. I married again, and my domestic life was a singularly happy one. As the colony grew greater, with every year I became even more wealthy than I had been, and was looked up to and respected by my fellow citizens. When my dear daughter Margaret was born, I felt that my cup of happiness was full, but suddenly I received a disagreeable reminder of the past. Rosanna's mother made her appearance one day, a disreputable-looking creature, smelling of gin, in whom I could not recognize the respectably dressed woman who used to accompany Rosanna to the theatre. She had spent long ago all the money I had given her, and had sunk lower and lower, until she now lived in a slum off Little Bourke Street. I made inquiries after the child, and she told me it was dead. Rosanna had not taken it to England with her, but had left it in her mother's charge, and no doubt neglect and want of proper nourishment was the cause of its death. There now seemed to be no link to bind me to the past with the exception of the old hag, who knew nothing about the marriage. I did not attempt to undeceive her, but agreed to allow her enough to live on if she promised never to trouble me again, and to keep quiet about everything which had reference to my connection with her daughter. She promised readily enough, and went back to her squalid dwelling in the slums, where, for all I know, she still lives, as money has been paid to her regularly every month by my solicitors. I heard nothing more about the matter, and now felt quite satisfied that I had heard the last of Rosanna. As years rolled on, things prospered with me, and so fortunate was I in all speculations that my luck became proverbial. Then, alas! when all things seemed to smile upon me, my wife died, and the world has never seemed the same to me since. But I had my dear daughter to console me, and in her love and affection I became reconciled to the loss of my wife. A young Irish gentleman, called Brian Fitzgerald, came out to Australia, and I soon saw that my daughter was in love with him, and that he reciprocated that affection, whereat I was glad, as I have always esteemed him highly. I looked forward to their marriage, when suddenly a series of events occurred which must be fresh in the memory of those who read these pages. Mr. Oliver White, a gentleman from London, called on me and startled me with the news that my first wife, Rosanna Moore, was still living, and that the story of her death had been an ingenious fabrication in order to deceive me. She had met with an accident, as stated in the newspaper, and had been taken to an hospital, where she recovered. The young doctor who had sent me the certificate of her death had fallen in love with her, and wanted to marry her, and had told me that she was dead in order that her past life might be obliterated. The doctor, however, died before the marriage, and Rosanna did not trouble herself about undeceiving me. She was then acting on the burlesque stage under the name of Musette, and seemed to have gained an unenviable notoriety by her extravagance and infamy. White met her in London, and she became his mistress. He seemed to have had a wonderful influence over her, for she told him all her past life, and about her marriage with me. Her popularity being on the wane in London, as she was now growing old, and had to make way for younger actresses, White proposed that they should proceed to the colonies and extort money from me, and he had come to me for that purpose. The villain told me all this in the coolest manner, and I, knowing he held the secret of my life, was unable to resent it. I refused to see Rosanna, but told White I would agree to his terms, which were, first, a large sum of money was to be paid to Rosanna, and secondly, that he should marry my daughter. I, at first, absolutely declined to sanction the latter proposal, but as he threatened to publish the story, and that meant the proclamation to the world of my daughter's illegitimacy, I at last agreed, and he began to pay his addresses to Madge. She, however, refused to marry him, and told me she was engaged to Fitzgerald, so after a severe struggle with myself, I told White that I would not allow him to marry Madge, but would give him whatever sum he liked to name. On the night he was murdered he came to see me, and showed me the certificate of marriage between myself and Rosanna Moore. He refused to take a sum of money, and said that unless I consented to his marriage with Madge, he would publish the whole affair. I implored him to give me time to think, so he said he would give me 2 days, but no more, and left the house, taking the marriage certificate with him. I was in despair, and saw that the only way to save myself was to obtain possession of the marriage certificate and deny everything. With this idea in mind I followed him up to town, and saw him meet Moreland, and drink with him. They went into the hotel in Russell Street, and when White came out, at 12:30, he was quite intoxicated. I saw him go along to the Scotch church, near the Bourke and Wills monument, and cling to the lamp-post at the corner. I thought I would then be able to get the certificate from him, as he was so drunk, when I saw a gentleman in a light coat, I did not know it was Fitzgerald, come up to him and hail a cab for him. I saw there was nothing more to be done at that time, so in despair went home and waited for the next day, in fear lest he should carry out his determination. Nothing, however, turned up, and I was beginning to think that White had abandoned his purpose, when I heard that he had been murdered in the Hansom Cab. I was in great fear lest the marriage certificate should be found on him, but nothing was said about it. This I could not understand at all. I knew he had it on him, and I could only conclude that the murderer, whoever he was, had taken it from the body, and would sooner or later come to me to extort money, knowing that I dare not denounce him. Fitzgerald was arrested, and afterwards acquitted, so I began to think that the certificate had been lost, and my troubles were at an end. However, I was always haunted by a dread that the sword was hanging over my head, and would fall sooner or later. I was right, for 2 nights ago Roger Moreland, who was an intimate friend of White's, called on me, and produced the marriage certificate, which he offered to sell me for £5,000. In horror I accused him of murdering White, which he denied at first, but afterwards acknowledged, stating that I dare not betray him for my own sake. I was nearly mad with the horror I was placed in, either to denounce my daughter as illegitimate or let a murderer escape the penalty of his crime. At last I agreed to keep silent, and handed him a cheque for £5,000, receiving in return the marriage certificate. I then made Moreland swear to leave the colony, which he readily agreed to do, saying Melbourne was dangerous. When he left I reflected upon the awfulness of my position, and had almost determined to commit suicide, but thank God I was saved from that crime. I write this confession in order that after my death the true story of the murder of White may be known, and that any one who may hereafter be accused of the murder may not be wrongfully punished. I have no hopes of Moreland ever receiving the penalty of his crime, as when this is opened all trace of him will, no doubt, be lost. I will not destroy the marriage certificate, but place it with these papers, so that the truth of my story can be seen. In conclusion, I would ask the forgiveness of my daughter Margaret for my sins, which have been visited on her, but she can see for herself that circumstances were too strong for me. May she forgive me, as I hope God in his infinite mercy will, and may she come sometimes and pray over my grave, nor think too hardly upon her dead father. End of Chapter 33. Read by Sabella Denton. For more free audiobooks or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 34 of Mystery of a Hansom Cab by Fergus Hume. Read for LibriVox.org into the public domain. The Hands of Justice. Calton's voice faltered a little when he read those last sad words, and he laid the manuscript down on the table, amid a dead silence, which was first broken by Brian. "Thank God," he said reverently, "thank God that he was innocent of the crime." "No," said Calton, a little cynically. "The riddle which has perplexed us so long is read, and the Sphinx is silent for evermore." "I knew he was incapable of such a thing," cried Chinston, whom emotion had hitherto kept silent. Meanwhile Kilsip listened to those eulogistic remarks on the dead man, and purred to himself, in a satisfied sort of way, like a cat who has caught a mouse. "You see, sir," he said, addressing the barrister, "I was right, after all." "Yes," answered Calton frankly, "I acknowledge my defeat, but now—" "I'm going to arrest Moreland right off," said Kilsip. There was a silence for a few moments, and then Calton spoke again. "I suppose it must be so. Poor girl, poor girl." "I'm very sorry for the young lady myself," said the detective in his soft, low voice, "but you see I cannot let a dangerous criminal escape for a mere matter of sentiment." "Of course not," said Fitzgerald sharply. "Moreland must be arrested right off." "But he will confess everything," said Calton angrily, "and then everyone will know about this first marriage." "Let them," retorted Brian bitterly. "As soon as she is well enough we will marry at once and leave Australia for ever." "But I know her better than you do," said the young man doggedly, "and I know she would like an end made of this whole miserable business at once. Arrest the murderer, and let him suffer for his crime." "Well, I suppose it must be so," said Chinston with a sigh. "But it seems very hard that this slur should be cast on Miss Frettlby." Brian turned a little pale. "The sins of the father are generally visited upon the children by the world," he said bitterly. "But after the first pain is over, in new lands among new faces, she will forget the bitter past." "Now that it is settled Moreland is to be arrested," said Calton, "how is it to be done? Is he still in Melbourne?" "Rather," said Kilsip in a satisfied tone. "I've had my eye on him for the last 2 months, and some one is watching him for me now. Trust me, he can't move 2 steps without my knowing it." "Ah, indeed," said Calton quickly. "Then do you know if he has been to the bank and cashed that cheque for 5,000 which Frettlby gave him?" "Well, now," observed Kilsip after a pause, "do you know you rather startled me when you told me he had received a cheque for that amount." "Why?" "It's such a large one," replied the detective, "and had I known what sum he had paid into his account I should have been suspicious." "Then he has been to the bank?" "To his own bank, yes. He went there yesterday afternoon at 2 o'clock. That is the day after he got it, so it would be sent round to Mr. Frettlby's bank, and would not be returned till next day, and as he died in the meanwhile I expect it hasn't been honoured, so Mr. Moreland won't have his money yet." "I wonder what he'll do," said Chinston. "Go to the manager and kick up a row," said Kilsip coolly, "and the manager will no doubt tell him he'd better see the executors." "But, my good friend, the manager doesn't know who the executors are," broke in Calton impatiently. "You forget the will has yet to be read." "Then he'll tell him to go to the late Mr. Frettlby's solicitors. I suppose he knows who they are," retorted Kilsip. "Thinton and Tarbit," said Calton, musingly. "But it's questionable if Moreland would go to them." "Why shouldn't he, sir?" said Kilsip, quickly. "He does not know anything about this," laying his hand on the confession, "and as the cheque is genuine enough, he won't let £5,000 go without a struggle." "I'll tell you what," observed Calton, after a few moments of reflection. "I'll go across the way and telephone to Thinton and Tarbit, and when he calls on them they can send him up to me." "A very good idea," said Kilsip, rubbing his hands, "and then I can arrest him." "But the warrant?" interposed Brian, as Calton rose and put on his hat. "Is here," said the detective, producing it. "By Jove! You must have been pretty certain of his guilt," remarked Chinston, drily. "Of course I was," retorted Kilsip, in a satisfied tone of voice. "When I told the magistrate where I found the coat, and reminded him of Moreland's acknowledgment at the trial that he had it in his possession before the murder, I soon got him to see the necessity of having Moreland arrested." "4:30, said Calton, pausing for a moment at the door and looking at his watch. "I'm afraid it's rather late to catch Moreland to-day. However, I'll see what Thinton and Tarbit know." And he went out. The rest sat waiting his return, and chatted about the curious end of the hansom cab mystery, when, in about 10 minutes, Calton rushed in hurriedly and closed the door after him. "Fate is playing into our hands," he said, as soon as he recovered his breath. "Moreland called on Thinton and Tarbit, as Kilsip surmised, and as neither of them was in, he said he would call again before 5 o'clock. I told the clerk to bring him up to me at once, so that he may be here at any moment." "That is, if he's fool enough to come," observed Chinston. "Oh, he'll come," said the detective, confidently, rattling a pair of handcuffs together. "He is so satisfied that he has made things safe that he'll walk right into the trap." It was getting a little dusk, and the four men were greatly excited, though they concealed it under an assumed nonchalance. "What a situation for a drama!" said Brian. "Only," said Chinston, quietly, "it is as realistic as in the old days of the Colosseum, where the actor who played Orpheus was torn to pieces by bears at the end of the play." "His last appearance on any stage, I suppose," said Calton, a little cruelly, it must be confessed. Meanwhile, Kilsip remained seated in his chair, humming an operatic air and chinking the handcuffs together, by way of accompaniment. He felt intensely pleased with himself, the more so as he saw that by this capture he would be ranked far above Gorby. And what would Gorby say? Gorby, who had laughed at all his ideas as foolish, who had been quite wrong from the first, if only— "Hush!" said Calton, holding up his finger, as steps were heard echoing on the flags outside. "Here he is, I believe." Kilsip arose from his chair, and, stealing softly to the window, looked cautiously out. Then he turned round to those inside, and, nodding his head, slipped the handcuffs into his pocket. Just as he did so, there was a knock at the door, and, in response to Calton's invitation to enter, Thinton and Tarbit's clerk came in with Roger Moreland. The latter faltered a little on the threshold, when he saw Calton was not alone, and seemed half inclined to retreat. But evidently thinking there was no danger of his secret being discovered, he pulled himself together, and advanced into the room in an easy and confident manner. "This is the gentleman who wants to know about the cheque, sir," said Thinton and Tarbit's clerk to Calton. "Oh, indeed," answered Calton, quietly. "I am glad to see him. You can go." The clerk bowed and went out, closing the door after him. Moreland took his seat directly in front of Calton, and with his back to the door. Kilsip, seeing this, strolled across the room in a nonchalant manner, while Calton engaged Moreland in conversation, and quietly turned the key. "You want to see me, sir?" said Calton, resuming his seat. "Yes, that is, alone," replied Moreland, uneasily. "Oh, these gentlemen are my friends," said Calton, quietly. "Anything you may say is quite safe." "That they are your friends and are quite safe is nothing to me," said Moreland, insolently. "I wish to speak to you in private." "Don't you think you would like to know my friends?" said Calton, coolly, taking no notice of his remark. "Damn your friends, sir!" cried Moreland, furiously, rising from his seat. Calton laughed, and introduced Mr. Moreland to the others. Dr. Chinston, Mr. Kilsip, and Mr. Fitzgerald. "Fitzgerald!" gasped Moreland, growing pale. What's that?" he shrieked as he saw White's coat, all weather-stained, lying on a chair near him, and which he immediately recognised. "That is the rope that's going to hang you," said Kilsip, quietly, coming up behind him, "for the murder of Oliver White." "Trapped, by God!" shouted the wretched man, wheeling round, so as to face Kilsip. He sprang at the detective's throat, and they both rolled together on the floor, but the latter was too strong for him, and, after a sharp struggle, he succeeded in getting the handcuffs on Moreland's wrists. The others stood around perfectly quiet, knowing that Kilsip required no assistance. Now that there was no possibility of escape, Moreland seemed to become resigned, and rose sullenly off the floor. I'll make you pay for this," he hissed between his teeth, with a white, despairing face. "You can't prove anything." "Can't we?" said Calton, touching the confession. "You are wrong. This is the confession of Mark Frettlby made before he died." "It's a lie." "A jury will decide that," said the barrister, dryly. "Meanwhile, you will pass the night in the Melbourne jail." "Ah! perhaps they'll give me the same cell as you occupied," said Moreland, with a hard laugh, turning to Fitzgerald. "I should like it for its old associations." Brian did not answer him, but picking up his hat and gloves, prepared to go. "Stop!" cried Moreland, fiercely. "I see that it's all up with me, so I'm not going to lie like a coward. I played for a big stake and lost, but if I hadn't been such a fool I'd have cashed that cheque the next morning, and been far away by this time." "It certainly would have been wiser," said Calton. "After all," said Moreland, nonchalantly, taking no notice of his remark, "I don't know what I'm sorry about. I've had a hell upon earth since I killed White." "Then you acknowledge your guilt?" said Brian, quietly. Moreland shrugged his shoulders. "I told you I wasn't a coward," he answered, coolly. "Yes, I did it. It was White's own fault. When I met him that night he told me how Frettlby wouldn't let him marry his daughter, but he said he'd make him, and showed me the marriage certificate. I thought if I could only get it, I'd make a nice pile out of Frettlby over it, so when White went on drinking I did not. After he had gone out of the hotel I put on his coat, which he left behind. I saw him standing near the lamp post, and Fitzgerald come up, and then leave him. When you came down the street," he went on, turning to Fitzgerald, "I shrank back into the shadow, and when you passed, I ran up to White as the cabman was putting him into the hansom. He took me for you, so I didn't undeceive him, but I swear I had no idea of murdering White when I got into the cab. I tried to get the papers, but he wouldn't let me, and commenced to sing out. Then I thought of the chloroform in the pocket of his coat, which I was wearing. I pulled it out, and found that the cork was loose. Then I took out White's handkerchief, which was also in the coat, and emptied the bottle on it, and put it back in my pocket. I tried again to get the papers, without using the chloroform, but couldn't, so I clapped the handkerchief over his mouth, and he went off after a few minutes, and I got the papers. I thought he was only insensible, and it was only when I saw the newspapers that I knew he was dead. I stopped the cab in St. Kilda Road, got out, and caught another cab, which was going to town. Then I got out at Powlett Street, took off the coat, and carried it over my arm. I went down George Street, towards the Fitzroy Gardens, and having hid the coat up a tree, where I suppose you found it, to Kilsip, I walked home. So I've done you all nicely, but—" "You're caught at last," finished Kilsip, quietly. Moreland fell down in a chair, with an air of utter weariness and lassitude. "No man can be stronger than destiny," he said, dreamily. "I have lost and you have won, so life is a chessboard, after all, and we are the puppets of fate." He refused to utter another word, so, leaving Calton and Kilsip with him, Brian and the doctor went out and hailed a cab. It drove up to the entrance of the court, where Calton's office was, and then Moreland, walking as if in a dream, left the room, and got into the cab, followed by Kilsip. "Do you know," said Chinston, thoughtfully, as they stood and watched the cab drive off, "do you know what the end of that man will be?" "It requires no prophet to foretell that," said Calton, dryly. "He will be hanged." "No, he won't," retorted the doctor. "He will commit suicide." Chapter 34. Read by Sibylla Denton. For more free audiobooks or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 35 of Mystery of a Hansom Cab by Fergus Hume. Read for LibriVox.org into the public domain. The Love That Lives. There are certain periods in the life of man when fate seems to have done her worst, and any further misfortunes which may befall are accepted with philosophical resignation, begotten by the very severity of previous trials. Fitzgerald was in this state of mind. He was calm, but it was the calmness of despair. The misfortunes of the past year seemed to have come to a climax, and he looked forward to the publication of the whole bitter story with an indifference that surprised himself. His own name, and that of Madge and her dead father, would be on every tongue, yet he felt perfectly callous to whatever might be said on the subject. So long as Madge recovered, and they could go away to another part of the world, leaving Australia, with its bitter memories, behind, he did not care. Moreland would suffer the bitter penalty of his crime, and then nothing more would ever be heard of the matter. It would be better for the whole story to be told, and transitory pain endured, than to go on striving to hide the infamy and shame which might be discovered at any moment. Already the news was all over Melbourne that the murderer of Oliver White had been captured, and that his confession would bring to light certain startling facts concerning the late Mark Frettlby. Brian well knew that the world winked at secret vices so long as there was an attempt at concealment, though it was cruelly severe on those which were brought to light, and that many whose lives might be secretly far more culpable than poor Mark Frettlby's would be the first to slander the dead man. The public curiosity, however, was destined never to be gratified, for the next day it was known that Roger Moreland had hanged himself in his cell during the night, and had left no confession behind him. When Brian heard this, he breathed a heartfelt prayer of thanks for his deliverance, and went to see Calton, whom he found at his chambers, in deep conversation with Chinston and Kilsip. They all came to the conclusion that, as Moreland was now dead, nothing could be gained by publishing the confession of Mark Frettlby, so agreed to burn it, and when Fitzgerald saw in the heap of blackened paper in the fireplace all that remained of the bitter story, he felt a weight lifted off his heart. The barrister, Chinston, and Kilsip all promised to keep silent, and they kept the promise nobly, for nothing was ever known of the circumstances which led to the death of Oliver White, and it was generally supposed that it must have been caused by some quarrel between the dead man and his friend Roger Moreland. Fitzgerald, however, did not forget the good service that Kilsip had done him, and gave him a sum of money which made him independent for life, though he still followed his old profession of a detective from sheer love of excitement, and was always looked upon with admiration as the man who had solved the mystery of the famous Hansom Cab murder. Brian, after several consultations with Calton, at last came to the conclusion that it would be useless to reveal to Sal Rawlins the fact that she was Mark Frettlby's daughter, as by the will the money was clearly left to Madge, and such a revelation could bring her no pecuniary benefit, while her bringing up unfitted her for the position. So a yearly income, more than sufficient for her wants, was settled upon her, and she was allowed to remain in ignorance of her parentage. The influence of Sal Rawlins's old life, however, was very strong on her, and she devoted herself to the task of saving her fallen sisters. Knowing, as she did, all the intricacies of the slums, she was enabled to do an immense amount of good, and many an unhappy woman was saved from the squalor and hardship of a gutter life by the kind hand of Sal Rawlins. Felix Rolleston became a member of Parliament, where his speeches, if not very deep, were at least amusing, and while in the House he always behaved like a gentleman, which could not be said of all his parliamentary colleagues. Madge slowly recovered from her illness, and as she had been explicitly named in the will as heiress to Mark Frettlby's great wealth, she placed the management of her estates in the hands of Mr. Calton, who, with Thinton and Tarbet, acted as her agents in Australia. On her recovery she learned the story of her father's early marriage, but both Calton and Fitzgerald were silent about the fact of Sal Rawlins being her half-sister, as such a relation could do no good, and would only create a scandal, as no explanation could be given except the true one. Shortly afterwards Madge married Fitzgerald, and both of them only too gladly left Australia, with all its sorrows and bitter memories. Standing with her husband on the deck of one of the P&O steamers as it ploughed the blue waters of Hobson's Bay into foam, they both watched Melbourne gradually fade from their view, under the glow of the sunset. They could see the two great domes of the Exhibition, and the Law Courts, and also Government House, with its tall tower rising from the midst of the green trees. In the background was a bright crimson sky, barred with masses of black clouds, and all over the great city hung a cloud of smoke like a pall. The flaring red light of the sinking sun glared angrily on the heavy waters, and the steamer seemed to be making its way through a sea of blood. Madge, clinging to her husband's arm, felt her eyes fill with tears, as she saw the land of her birth receding slowly. "Good-bye," she murmured softly. "Good-bye for ever." "You do not regret?" he said, bending his head. "Regret, no," she answered, looking at him with loving eyes. "With you by my side I fear nothing. Surely our hearts have been tried in the furnace of affliction, and our love has been chastened and purified." "We are sure of nothing in this world," replied Brian with a sigh. "But after all the sorrow and grief of the past, let us hope that the future will be peace. Peace!" A white-winged sea-gull rose suddenly from the crimson waters, and circled rapidly in the air above them. "A happy omen," she said, looking up fondly to the grave face of her husband, "for your life and for mine." He bent down and kissed her. The great steamer moved slowly out to sea, and as they stood on the deck, hand clasped in hand, with a fresh salt breeze blowing keenly in their faces, it bore them away into the placid beauty of the coming night, towards the old world and the new life. End of Chapter 35. End of Mystery of a Hansom Cab by Fergus Hume. Read by Sibella Denton in Carrollton, Georgia, in August 2008. For more free audiobooks or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org.